She meant to send the files to a journalist. Instead, she sent her location to the most dangerous man in the city. And now he's standing in the alley, staring at the bruise on her throat, asking one quiet question that's about to get people killed. If you've ever been in a situation where one mistake changed everything, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit like. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain didn't care about any of it. It came down hard and sideways off the rooftops of the Vanta district, hammering neon signs and splitting into white mist where it hit the hot asphalt, and it soaked through Emery Vale's jacket in the first 30 seconds she was outside. She didn't notice. She was already running before the back door of Club Vanta swung shut behind her, already calculating the distance to the street, already listening for footsteps over the sound of her own breathing. She heard them. 3 sets, moving fast. The alley behind Vanta was narrow and smelled like the inside of a trash compactor. Rotting cardboard, bleach, the faint sweet rot of something dead under the dumpsters. Emery knew it the way she knew most things she shouldn't have to know. By necessity. She'd taken this route before. Late nights, wrong situations, bad decisions that compounded into worse ones. The alley spilled out onto Crane Street 60 yards ahead. 60 yards of shadows and wet concrete, and nothing between her and the people coming out of that door. She made it 40 before she heard Cole's voice. Emery. Just her name. Nothing else. That was the thing about Cole Mercer that most people never understood. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten in full sentences. He said her name the way a man checks a lock he already knows is broken. Quiet, certain, patient in the particular way that people who've never faced consequences learn to be patient. She stopped. Turned. He was standing at the door with 2 men flanking him, both in plain clothes but carrying themselves the way cops carry themselves even when they're trying not to. One of them, the bigger one, Raines, she'd seen him before, was already unhooking the latch on a panel gate that blocked the shortcut to Crane Street, closing the exit. Professional about it, Cole walked toward her at a normal pace, his hands in his coat pockets, rainwater running off the brim of his hat. Wallet, phone, and the drive, he said. That's all I want. Emery took a step back. Her heel hit a piece of broken crate, and she stumbled, caught herself against the brick wall, and the impact opened up the cut above her eyebrow that she'd been nursing for 2 days. She felt the blood before she felt the pain, warm and immediate, running into her left eye. Cole, don't, he said. His voice hadn't changed. Don't do the thing where you explain yourself. I don't need an explanation. I need the drive. I don't have it on me. That's a lie. It was. The drive was duct taped to the inside of her left shoe, pressing against the arch of her foot with every step she'd taken for the last 36 hours. She hadn't trusted anywhere else. Hadn't trusted anyone else. The journalist she was supposed to contact, a freelancer named Solis who'd been sniffing around port corruption for 2 years, was supposed to meet her tonight 3 blocks from here. That was before Mercer found out, before whatever informant he had inside the building watched her copy those files and picked up a phone. If something happens to me, Emery said, the files go out automatically. I set it up. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled, and it was the worst version of his smile. The one she'd seen in the apartment, in the car, in the kitchen at 2 a.m. when he decided she'd said the wrong thing. You didn't, he said. You're not that organized. He was right. She hadn't. She'd thought about it, and she hadn't done it. And now she was standing in a flooded alley with blood in her eye and nowhere to go, and Cole Mercer was about 15 feet away and closing. Her hand was already in her jacket pocket. The phone was cracked. She'd dropped it on the fire escape getting out of his apartment 2 nights ago, and the screen threw fractured light across her palm when she unlocked it. She'd had the contact saved for 8 months. She'd put it there the night she bartended a private game at the Leland Club, when a man in a black suit had tipped her $300 in cash and handed her a card that said nothing on it except a string of numbers. One of the regulars had grabbed her arm when the man left and said, "Real quiet, don't lose that." She'd asked why. The regular had just looked at her. She'd saved the contact under the name Last Resort. She'd meant to pull up Solis's number. She knew that later, when she had time to think about it, She'd recognized that her hands were shaking and her vision was compromised and her brain was operating on 30 hours without sleep and pure adrenaline. And those were the conditions under which a person hits the wrong contact and sends the wrong message. She knew all that. It didn't change what happened. She hit share location. She hit send. Then she looked up and Cole was 5 feet away, and she had time to take exactly 1 step backward before his hand closed around her arm. He pulled her close. Not rough. Cole was rarely rough in public, even in an alley with no audience. He was worse than rough. He was quiet. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said. "Get off me." "The drive, Emery." "I said get off me." He shifted his grip to her wrist and twisted, and the pain went from her wrist to her shoulder in one white bolt, and she bit down on a sound she refused to make in front of him. She'd made that mistake before. She knew what it did to him. The phone was still in her hand. She looked at the screen. The message had delivered. Seen. 3 dots appeared below the read receipt, pulsing in the cracked screen light. Then they vanished. Cole pulled her toward the dumpster and she went because the other option was a broken wrist. And she was thinking about Solus, thinking about the files, thinking about the 12 other women whose names she'd found in those records. Women moved through ports, women listed as cargo, women whose names appeared in shipping manifests between line items for industrial equipment and chemical imports. And she thought, if I go down here, none of it comes out. It dies in an alley like everything else. The 2 officers were talking. She caught fragments. Something about a car. Something about the DA's office having questions tomorrow, which meant they were running out of runway, which meant Cole was scared, which meant he was dangerous in a different way than usual. Then the headlights hit the mouth of the alley. Just one set, at first. A black SUV sitting at the alley entrance with its engine idling, headlights aimed straight down the corridor. Cole's grip on her arm didn't loosen, but he looked up. So did Rains in the other one. Then a second SUV pulled in from the opposite end. Then a third. Then 4 more came from both sides until there were 8 of them. A hard black wall of vehicles at both ends of the alley, engines low and steady, and the doors were opening in a way that Emery had never seen before. Not quickly, not in a rush, but in perfect synchronization, like something rehearsed 1,000 times. And the men who stepped out weren't moving fast either. They moved like they had nowhere to be. Like time worked differently for them. Cole's grip loosened by a degree. What the... The men formed lines at both ends. Rain ran off their shoulders. None of them shouted. None of them raised their weapons immediately. They just stood there, and the stillness of them was worse than anything loud would have been. The last door to open was at the center SUV. The man who stepped out was tall and moved like something that had been built rather than born. No excess, no waste, each step landing exactly where it should. He was wearing a dark coat that the rain hit and slid off of, and he had his hands in his pockets, and he was looking at the alley the way a man looks at something that already belongs to him. Lucien Graves. Emery knew the name the way you know the name of a disease, not from personal experience, but from the way people said it, the way they dropped their voices, the way the regulars at the Leland Club cleared the bar whenever he arrived, not because they were told to, but because proximity to that much power made most people want to be somewhere else. She'd seen him twice from a distance. She'd never been in the same room. She wasn't sure room was the right word for whatever this alley had become. He looked across the corridor directly at her. His eyes moved down to the blood running from the cut above her eyebrow, then lower to Cole's hand on her arm, then lower to the bruising at the base of her throat. Old bruising, 4 days old, yellow-green at the edges, the kind that sits on the skin like a signature. Something in his face went very, very quiet. "Who touched her?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud. He didn't project it. He just said it, and the acoustics of the alley and the particular quality of his stillness made it carry to every corner anyway. Cole released her arm. She didn't know if he did it consciously. She didn't think he knew either. Lucien walked forward. His men moved with him, not flanking him dramatically, just maintaining position, like water moving around a stone. Cole tried to get ahead of it. He reached for his badge with one hand and held up the other. "Detective Cole Mercer, Vanta District Narcotics. This is a law enforcement operation. You need to stand down immediately." Lucien looked at the badge the way he might look at a bus ticket someone was presenting as a deed to property. "Badges stop civilians," he said. That was all. 2 words. 3 if you counted the implied, not me. Cole opened his mouth again, and one of Lucian's men stepped in front of him with the particular smoothness of someone who'd done this before, and the badge went one direction and Cole went another, and it all happened in about 4 seconds and mostly in silence. The 2 officers moved. They shouldn't have. What followed wasn't a fight in any real sense. It was a correction. Rains went down in 6 seconds. The other one lasted 8, which might have been personal best for him. Neither of them came back up. Emery pressed her back against the wall and held absolutely still. Her heart was doing something loud and disorganized behind her sternum, and she had blood drying in her left eye, and she was standing in a flooded alley watching the most feared man in 3 counties dismantle a narcotics operation like he was returning a wrong order. Lucian came to her last. He stopped about 2 feet away and looked at her, not sizing her up, not cataloging her the way Cole always did, making her feel like inventory, just looking. She made herself hold the eye contact because looking away felt worse. "You sent me a location," he said, by accident. "I know." He studied the cut above her eyebrow for a moment. Then he reached into his coat, slowly, in a way that was clearly deliberate, clearly designed not to spook her, and took out a folded cloth that was probably worth more than her monthly rent. He held it out. She didn't move. "It won't hurt you," he said, and the flatness of it was so devoid of performance that she almost laughed. He wasn't reassuring her. He was just stating a fact, the way you'd tell someone a door was unlocked. She took it, pressed it to the cut. He shrugged off his coat. "Come with me," he said. She looked at the alley. Cole was being loaded into an SUV without gentleness. His officers were zip-tied against the wall. 3 of Lucien's men were already sweeping the ground for casings, moving with quiet efficiency, erasing. "To where?" she asked. "Somewhere dry," Lucien said, and turned and walked toward the center vehicle like the answer was obvious, and the only question was whether she was smart enough to follow. Emery stood in the rain for 2 more seconds. Then she followed. The inside of the SUV was silent and warm and smelled like leather and something clean. Emery sat with the cloth pressed to her forehead and looked at her hands, the right one still holding the cracked phone, the left one trying to decide whether to shake. She told it not to. It partially listened. Lucien sat across from her, not next to her, which she noticed. He was looking out the tinted window as the vehicle moved, his jaw set, his posture easy in the way that people who haven't had to be physically afraid in a long time carry themselves. "The drive," he said, without turning. Her stomach dropped. "What about it?" "Whatever you took from Mercer's apartment. It's the reason he had you in that alley." She didn't say anything. Lucien turned then and looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, not threatening, but not comfortable either. Something in between. Assessing. "I'm not asking you to hand it to me," he said. "I'm telling you what you're carrying, because what you think is on that drive and what's actually on it are probably 2 different things. I've seen what's on it." "You've seen what Mercer had stored under his own access level," Lucien said. "There are 3 encryption layers below what you reached. I know this because I've been trying to get inside that system for 4 months through a different channel." The SUV hit a smooth stretch of road, and Emery felt the city sliding past the window. Wet streets, corner stores, the underside of the elevated rail, all of it looking slightly unreal from inside this much glass and insulation. "What's in the other layers?" she said. Lucien looked back out the window. "Names," he said. "Specific ones. People who run the network Mercer was servicing. People who have been operating inside my organization without my knowledge." A pause. "Someone sold your location tonight. It wasn't Mercer's people. They wouldn't have known where to look." Emery processed this. "You have a leak." "Had," Lucien said, and the past tense sat there between them like a door that had just been locked. She looked out her own window. A bridge was crossing above them, the girders throwing shadows in sequence, and she watched the shadows move across her hands and thought about the names she had seen in the files. The shipping logs. The 12 women. The amounts moved between accounts that belonged to holding companies that belonged to other holding companies. "The drive has trafficking records," she said. "Women moved through the Eastport complex." 27, Lucian said quietly. In the last 14 months. She turned to look at him. His jaw was tight. He wasn't looking at her. I found out 3 weeks ago, he said. The port facilities involved. 3 of them are adjacent to operations I use for legitimate shipping. Someone used the proximity deliberately. To move product through infrastructure no one would risk inspecting. He paused. They used my shadow to hide in. And Mercer was the enforcement side, the badge that made the paperwork disappear, the warrant that never got filed. Something moved through his expression. Not anger exactly, something more contained than anger. He wasn't just dirty, he was an architect. Emery sat with that. The drive pressed against the arch of her foot, a small hard weight that had been costing her sleep and safety for 2 days. She thought about Solus, about the story he'd been trying to write, about what it meant that she'd accidentally sent her location to the wrong person instead, and that wrong person had shown up in 8 SUVs and pulled a narcotics detective off her arm and now knew things about the files that she didn't. Why are you telling me this? She said. Lucian finally looked at her. Because you went into that apartment, copied those files, and walked out knowing what happens to people who cross Mercer, he said. That means you decided the information mattered more than your own safety. He studied her face. I want to know why. Emery's jaw tightened. Because I knew the women on those logs. One of them was my... She stopped. One of them I knew. Lucien held her gaze. There are things I need from that drive, he said, and there are things on it that belong to you. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to understand that right now, tonight, you have 2 choices. You go back to your life, whatever's left of it, after Mercer puts your name on every warrant he can fabricate before his arrest. Or you come with me and we figure out what we're each carrying before one of us gets killed by the parts the other one didn't know about. He said it without inflection. No sales pitch. No warmth in it. Just logistics. Which was, Emery thought, more honest than most of the sincere things people had said to her in the last 2 years. How long? She said. Until it's done. What does done mean? Lucian turned back to the window. It means Mercer doesn't exist in any meaningful way anymore, he said. The network he was running doesn't operate. The people on those logs get what they deserve. And me? He was quiet for a moment. You get to be somewhere safe, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not performative, not a promise meant to land soft, that hit her somewhere she wasn't expecting, like a door opening onto a room she'd forgotten existed. She looked at the city out the window, at the rain running in rivers down the glass. Okay, she said. The SUV turned north toward the upper districts, toward the skyline she'd been looking at from bar windows for 3 years and never gotten close to. She didn't know that the drive had already been scanned remotely the moment her phone connected to the SUV's network. She didn't know that Lucien's people had been inside Mercer's system for 6 hours, pulling secondary files she'd never accessed. She didn't know that the name she was going to find in Layer 2, a name attached to shell companies and port manifests and a ghost organization that Lucien had been circling for the better part of a year, was a name that was also sitting in Lucien's phone under a contact he'd trusted for 4 years. She didn't know any of that yet, but by morning she would. And by morning, Lucien Graves, a man who had not been surprised by anything in longer than he could remember, was going to be standing in front of a screen staring at a name he recognized, and his hands were going to be very, very still, which was always when he was most dangerous. The city blurred past in the rain. Emery Vale pressed a borrowed cloth to a cut above her eye, sat in the back of a car belonging to the most feared man she'd ever been in the same room with, and told herself, "You're not out of danger. You're just in a different kind of it." She was right. She had no idea how right. The penthouse was on the 34th floor of a building that didn't have a public address. Emery figured that out when the SUV pulled into a subterranean garage that wasn't on any map she'd ever seen, accessed through a service tunnel off an industrial block that looked abandoned from the street. The garage was clean and cold and fully lit, lined with vehicles that ranged from nondescript sedans to armored transports, and the men who moved through it did so without looking at her, which she'd already started to understand was a form of professionalism rather than indifference. They weren't ignoring her. They were giving her space that she hadn't asked for but apparently needed. The elevator required a palm scan and a code. Lucien did both without looking, the way you unlock your own front door at the end of a long night. The doors opened directly into the penthouse. Emery stepped out and stood very still for a moment. The space was large and dark, and utilitarian in a way that surprised her. She'd expected something performative, the kind of wealth that needed to be seen, marble and crystal, and things chosen to impress. Instead, it was spare. High ceilings, concrete floors with dark rugs, furniture that was expensive the way tools are expensive, built for function, no excess. One entire wall was glass, overlooking the city, rain still hammering the panes, the skyline smearing in the wet. The opposite wall held screens, 8 of them, running feeds she didn't have time to catalog before Lucien moved past her toward a door on the left. "Bathroom's through there," he said without stopping. "First aid kit is under the sink." She looked at the screens. One of them showed the alley. Not in real time. Archived footage, she thought, but it was already being edited, condensed, compressed into something that would be indistinguishable from nothing if anyone ever looked. "You're erasing it," she said. "Managing it," Lucien said from the other room. "Is there a difference?" He appeared in the doorway, jacket off now, rolling his sleeves to the elbow with the focused efficiency of someone who did not waste motion. "In this case, yes. The footage goes to 3 different places. One of those places is a federal evidence repository that Mercer's internal people don't have access to." He looked at her. "The alley happened. It's documented. It just doesn't look the way Mercer would want it to look." Emery processed this. "You were recording the whole time." "My vehicles record everything within 40 meters. Have for 6 years." He moved toward a cabinet near the kitchen. "It saved my life twice and ended 12 careers." He pulled out a bottle of water and set it on the counter near her. "Go clean the cut. It needs closing." She went because her head was starting to pound, and standing on pride in a penthouse at 2 a.m. felt like the wrong allocation of energy. The bathroom was clean and white and had a first aid kit the size of a tackle box under the sink. She sat on the edge of the tub and peeled back the cloth from her forehead and looked at herself in the mirror for the first time in 2 days. She looked like someone who'd been sleeping in other people's spaces and eating when she remembered to. The cut was shallow but stubborn, still seeping. The bruising on her throat had gone that ugly transitional yellow that meant it was healing, which felt like a cruel joke given the night's events. She was butterflying the cut closed with strips from the kit when the door opened without a knock. She turned. Lucien stood in the doorway, looked at her hands, and said nothing. Then he crossed the room in 3 steps, crouched to her level, which put him below her eye line, which she noticed, and took the butterfly strip from her fingers. "You're angling it wrong," he said. "It'll pull open when you sleep." "I wasn't planning on sleeping." "You're going to sleep," he said, in the same tone as the door is unlocked. Not a command, a fact. He applied the strips with a steadiness she hadn't expected. His hands were large, and there was old scarring across the knuckles of his right hand, and a faint chemical burn on his left forearm that was years old, and he worked with the careful precision of someone who had done this kind of repair on themselves enough times to know how it was supposed to feel. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and examined his work, and then looked at her. His eyes moved to her throat. "How long?" he said. She knew what he was asking. 8 months. Something in his jaw shifted. "Did you try to leave before?" 3 times. She looked at the mirror instead of him. "First time he reported me to my building management as a disturbance risk. Got me evicted. Second time he had a patrol car parked outside my sister's house for 2 weeks until I came back. Third time..." She stopped. "Third time," he said. She showed him the inside of her left forearm. A scar, thin and white, healed over, that she'd gotten when Cole threw a coffee mug across a kitchen, and it didn't miss by as much as he claimed. Lucien looked at it for a long time. He didn't say anything, which was better than most responses she'd gotten. He stood up, rinsed his hands at the sink, and handed her a clean cloth. "There's a room at the end of the hall," he said. "The door locks from the inside. Code is 0711. No one in this building will enter without your permission." She looked at him in the mirror. "Including you?" she asked. "Including me," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, which was either the most reassuring thing anyone had ever said to her in a bathroom or the most sophisticated lie. She decided to provisionally believe it. He left. She sat in the white light a moment longer, listening to the rain against the high windows, and thought about the drive against her foot. Then she took off her shoe and peeled back the tape and held the small black rectangle in her palm under the bathroom lights. 27 women. She'd seen the logs. Partial names, port codes, manifest numbers. She hadn't been able to open the second or third encryption layers. She didn't have the tools. But Lucian said he knew about those layers, said he'd been trying to get in for 4 months through a different channel. She thought about what that meant. It meant he'd known this was coming before she'd ever walked into Mercer's apartment. It meant this war had been running longer than her involvement in it. It meant she was not the beginning of anything. She was a variable someone had introduced into an existing equation, and the equation had been running without her, and the people on both sides of it had been making moves she knew nothing about. She put the drive in the inside pocket of her jacket and went to find the room at the end of the hall. It was Spartan and clean. She slept for 5 hours without dreaming, which felt like the most generous thing the night had given her. She woke to voices, not in the room, down the hall, behind a closed door, but elevated enough to carry. She lay still for a moment, orienting, and then the voice that wasn't Lucien's got loud enough to make out words, and she recognized the particular frequency of someone trying to stay controlled and failing. She got up. The hall was empty. The door to what she assumed was some kind of operations room was closed but not latched, and the gap threw a wedge of yellow light across the concrete floor. She heard a name. Victor. She'd heard it once before, in the SUV. Lucien had mentioned a lieutenant. She hadn't asked about it then. She stood 2 feet from the door and listened. Told you he was in that corridor. I'm telling you he was not supposed to know she existed until we decided he needed to know. The other voice. Older, controlled. Then explain the scan. Lucien, flat and precise. The port manifest for the Eastport Annex, the one with the 3rd layer encryption, it was accessed twice in the last 72 hours. Once by Mercer's people. Once by a terminal registered to our secondary logistics hub. A pause. That could be any of 12 people with access to that terminal. It could be, Lucien said. But it was accessed at 2:14 in the morning on a Tuesday when 2 of those 12 people were confirmed overseas, 4 were on rotation at the Leland facility, and the other 6 hadn't logged a late access in the last 8 months except for 1. A beat. You want to tell me something, Victor? Another pause. Longer. You're wrong, the other voice said. I'm never wrong about numbers, Lucien said. I've been wrong about people, which is different, and worse, and something I'm adjusting for as of tonight. Emery heard footsteps moving inside the room and stepped back from the door, pressing into the wall of the hallway. She was holding her breath. The door opened. A man came out. Late 50s, wide through the shoulders, a face that had been handsome 20 years ago and had settled into something harder. He walked past without seeing her in the shadow of the wall, or if he saw her, he chose not to acknowledge it, which felt more likely and more deliberate. She waited until the elevator closed, then she pushed the door open. Lucien was standing at the screens with his back to her, both hands flat on a long table, looking at a grid of numbers and camera feeds. He didn't turn when she came in. You were listening, he said. The door wasn't closed. I know. He straightened. Sit down. She sat on the edge of a chair near the table and looked at the screens. One of them showed Victor in the elevator, looking straight ahead, his reflection doubled in the steel doors. Is he the leak? She said. Lucien sat down across from her and put a tablet on the table between them. The screen showed a port manifest, dense with codes, and one column highlighted in red. Timestamps, locations, a terminal ID. The access log says yes, he said. Victor says no. Victor has been saying no about things for 20 years, and usually he's been right. He looked at the screen. But usually I could verify. This one I can't verify without the 3rd layer key, which is on your drive. Emery sat with this. You need the drive to find out if your own man betrayed you. I need the drive to confirm what I already believe is true, Lucien said, and the distinction seemed to matter to him. I'm not going to act on a belief without confirmation. That's how good people become casualties. She reached into her jacket. He watched her take out the drive and set it on the table without reaching for it. You know I could have taken that from you while you were sleeping, he said. I know. But you're still setting it down. She looked at him. You didn't. Something in his face shifted. Not much, just a degree or two, like a door moving in wind. He picked up the drive and turned it over in his fingers once, and then slid it into a reader on the table. This is going to take time, he said. The third layer uses a rotational key. My team has been running a brute force approach for 4 months. With this physical access, it's down to hours, not weeks. Hours, Emery said. Maybe 6, maybe 12. He looked at her. You should eat. She realized she was starving. The kitchen was at the other end of the penthouse. Lucien made coffee with the focused silence of a person for whom making coffee is a ritual rather than a task. And Emery found bread and eggs and made herself something without asking because asking felt strange. They ate at the kitchen counter in silence, while outside the rain finally started to break up, the sky going from black to a deep gray purple, the city lights beginning to dim against the coming morning. The women in the logs, she said. The 27. Do you know what happened to them? Lucien set down his cup. Some, he said. Not all. 11 of them we've located in the last 3 weeks. 3 of them are in facilities outside the country. The others, he stopped. The others we're still finding. The one I knew, Emery said. Her name was Sasha Rell. She was 22. She worked at the same bar I did for 8 months before she disappeared. Lucien was very still. Rell, he said. You know that name. She's in the third layer files, he said carefully, or we believe she is based on the manifest codes, which is why we need the key. Emery looked at her hands on the countertop. Sasha had been small and loud and had laughed too hard at her own jokes, the particular laugh of someone who'd had reasons not to laugh and decided to do it anyway. She'd vanished on a Tuesday in March, and the police report had lasted approximately 4 days before it was deprioritized. Cole had been the officer who'd processed the initial report. She hadn't known that until she opened his files. Cole processed her missing persons report, Emery said. I saw his signature on the intake form. He flagged it as voluntary departure. The silence that followed had texture. He closed it himself, Lucien said, in 36 hours. She looked up. She was already on a manifest by then. I checked the dates. Lucien stood up from the counter. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking at the city, and she watched the muscles in his back and shoulders and understood that she was watching someone managing something large and controlled and dangerous that wanted to be otherwise. He knew her by name, Emery said. He came into the bar. He was the one who... She stopped, started again. He introduced himself to her. I thought it was just, a cop being friendly. I didn't... She closed her mouth. You couldn't have known, Lucien said to the window. I recommended the bar to her, Emery said. I told her it was good money and safe hours. I vouched for the owner. She heard herself say it, and it sounded the way it had been sounding in her head for 6 months, which was like a sentence being read at a trial. Lucien turned around. Stop, he said. I brought her there. Stop, he said again, and crossed back to the counter in 3 steps and put both hands flat on it across from her, dropping his head to her eye level. Listen to me. The man who moved her is responsible for what happened to her. The woman who recommended a job is not. Are you hearing me? She looked at him. His face was close enough that she could see the details. The faint scar at the corner of his jaw, the lines around his eyes that were deeper than they should be for his age, the effort in his expression of someone who was choosing words with care. I hear you, she said. That's not the same as believing me. No, she said, it's not. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he straightened and refilled both cups, and they sat in the early morning quiet while the sky outside lightened by degrees. The alert came at 9:47 a.m. Emery was in the operations room when the tone came through on a secondary terminal, not the main screens, a smaller one on the left that ran a news aggregation feed. Lucien was on the phone across the room, low and fast, and he looked at the terminal and his expression didn't change. But she'd been watching him long enough in the last 12 hours to notice what didn't change, which was everything that should have. She read the scroll. Breaking. Vanta District woman sought in connection with theft of narcotics evidence. Emery Vale, 24, believed to have stolen sensitive materials from a law enforcement operation, considered armed and connected to organized crime elements. Public asked to Cole, she said. Lucienne was off the phone. It went out 40 minutes ago, 4 local stations and 2 state-level feeds. He moved fast. He's scared, Lucienne said. Scared people make noise. It's predictable. She looked at her face on the screen. A photo from her bartending license, flat and tired-looking, nothing like the person she felt like right now. Connected to organized crime elements. She thought, well, that part's accurate now. My sister, she said. Already covered, Lucienne said. She was moved to a secondary address at 6 this morning. She doesn't know why. She thinks it's a water main issue in her building. Emery turned to look at him. You moved my sister. My people noted she was a potential leverage point, he said without apology. It was handled. You did that without telling me. I did it at 5:30 while you were asleep because the window for doing it quietly closed at 7. He met her gaze steadily. You can be angry about the process. You shouldn't be angry about the outcome. She was angry about both, which she decided to file for later. By noon, 2 judges had quietly received encrypted packages. She didn't know what was in them. Lucienne didn't tell her, but both judges canceled scheduled hearings involving cases tied to Mercer's unit. By mid-afternoon, a city councilman who had publicly called for a corruption investigation 3 years ago and then abruptly dropped it suddenly filed a motion to reopen proceedings. She watched it happen from the operations room and felt something uncomfortable. Not quite admiration, not quite awe. Something more specific. The recognition that power, when applied with surgical precision by someone who understood systems, looked nothing like the loud, blunt performance of it she'd lived with for 8 months. Cole's version of power was a hand around a wrist. This was something else entirely. She was thinking about that when Victor returned. She heard him before she saw him. The elevator, the step pattern she'd already unconsciously catalogued. Lucienne heard it too. He didn't move from his position at the central table, just angled his chin slightly, which she had already learned was a signal to his people to maintain position without visible response. Victor came into the operations room. He looked at Emery first, briefly, with an expression she couldn't read. Then he looked at Lucienne. The port supervisor at Eastport Terminal 4 is dead, Victor said. The room went still. When? Lucienne said. They found him an hour ago, staged as a heart attack. Medical examiner's preliminary says 48 hours, which puts it at Tuesday night, Lucienne said. Same window as the terminal access. Victor spread his hands. Someone's cleaning house. Someone who knew the supervisor was a liability, Lucienne said. Someone who knew which people connected to that operation were about to become problems. Victor's jaw tightened. You're still looking at me for this. I'm looking at the facts for this, Lucienne said. The facts keep landing in your vicinity. I've been with you since... I know how long you've been with me, Lucienne said, and there was something in his voice that was worse than anger, a kind of grief that had been routed through something much colder. Which is why this is a conversation and not a conclusion. Yet. Victor looked at him for a long moment. The supervisor had a secondary ledger, Victor said. Physical, paper. His wife found it this morning before the body. She called me because I'm her husband's named emergency contact in our system. He reached into his coat and produced a sealed plastic bag with a small bound notebook inside. He set it on the table between them. I came directly here. Lucienne looked at the bag, didn't touch it. Why didn't you call? He said. Because you need to see me hand this to you, Victor said. You need to see my face when I do it. Because if I called, you'd receive information. This way you receive information and a person. The room was very quiet. Emery watched Lucien's face. He picked up the bag. He looked at Victor for another beat. Something long and specific passing between them, the compressed language of men who have known each other through dangerous years. And then he opened the bag. The ledger was small and cheap, the kind sold at corner pharmacies. The pages were dense with handwriting, columns of numbers, abbreviations, names. Lucienne turned pages slowly, and after the third page he stopped. He set the ledger down. He looked at a specific line. Emery couldn't see the page from where she was standing, but she saw his face. She'd watched him manage enormous things without visible reaction all morning. She'd watched him receive bad news and worse news and handle both with the same controlled deliberateness. This was different. Whatever was on that page, it was something he hadn't planned for. He looked up slowly. Not at Victor, past Victor. At the middle distance, the way people look when they're doing rapid internal calculation on something they need to be very careful about before they speak. "Get out," he said to Victor. Quiet, measured. "Go to the Leland facility and stay there. Don't communicate with anyone except through the closed channel. No exceptions." Victor looked at the ledger, then at Lucien's face. "How bad?" Victor said. Lucien didn't answer. Victor left. Emery waited. Lucien stood at the table with his hands flat on either side of the open ledger, head down, for almost a full minute. Then he looked up at her and said, "There's a name in this ledger connected to 3 of the shell companies in Mercer's trafficking network." He paused. "It's someone I've trusted for 4 years. Someone who has had access to every significant decision I've made since I restructured the organization." Emery moved closer to the table. She looked at the page. She didn't recognize the name, but she recognized one of the abbreviations in the column next to it, a port code she'd seen in Mercer's files. EPC 7, Eastport Corridor 7, the same corridor where the third layer manifests routed the women. "This person knew about the trafficking," she said. "Facilitated it," Lucien said, and the word landed in the room like something being dropped from a height. "They didn't just know, they helped design the routing, used my infrastructure as cover. For years." Emery looked at his hands on the table. The knuckles were white. "What are you going to do?" she said. Lucien straightened slowly. He closed the ledger. "Something I should have done 4 years ago," he said. "When I first felt the thing I didn't want to feel about this person and chose to believe in loyalty instead." She looked at him. "I'm going," he said. "Tonight. Alone." It's not your problem," he said, and there was no sharpness in it, just a door closing. "Stay here. Don't contact anyone outside. The drive will finish decrypting in the next few hours. When it does, your files on the women will be preserved exactly as you found them. I'll have them sent to your journalist contact before morning." "Lucien!" He was already moving toward the door. "Lucien!" she said again, louder. He stopped. She crossed the room to him, stood 2 feet away and looked at his face, the controlled surface of it, the specific kind of stillness that she was learning to read as the effort it was. "If you go alone," she said, "and something goes wrong, and the drive finishes decrypting here without you, there's no one to send the files. They stay on a table in your building." She paused. "And 27 women stay in a ledger that no one else knows exists." He looked at her. Something behind his eyes moved. "You're not coming," he said. "I'm not asking to come," she said. "I'm asking you to not go alone. Bring someone you trust." "I just found out the person I trusted most is the enemy," he said, and it came out rawer than she thought he intended, the sentence slightly uneven at the end. They stood in the narrow space between them. "Then trust someone new," she said. The city moved outside the glass, morning sliding toward afternoon, everything below them continuing without pause, indifferent, enormous and specific all at once. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached past her to the table and picked up his phone and made a call. She heard him say, "Bring the car around, both of you, and bring the secondary kit." A pause. "No, not Victor, not anymore." He hung up and looked at her. "Stay here," he said again. But this time it sounded less like a command and more like something he was saying because he didn't know how to say what he actually meant, which she was starting to understand was a habit of his. The gap between what he said and what he meant, and the width of that gap was exactly the width of everything he'd learned not to expect from the world. She sat down. She listened to him leave. And then she waited in the operations room while the decryption ran its clock down on the table, and outside the city turned from afternoon toward evening. And somewhere below them, in a building she didn't know the address of, Lucien Graves was walking toward a person he'd trusted with his life for 4 years. A person who had been selling 27 women through port corridors registered to his own shipping network. The decryption hit 40%, then 50%. Then the alert on the secondary terminal changed. Not a news feed this time. A security feed. Exterior camera, east entrance of the building. 3 black sedans. Not Lucien. She was on her feet before she understood why. The sedans were parked nose to tail along the service entrance, and the men getting out of them were moving with that particular professional economy she'd seen in the alley. Except these men weren't moving the way Lucien's people moved. They were moving faster, more exposed, the way people move when they're running a timeline and the timeline is short. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She picked up. The voice on the other end was Cole Mercer, and he said, "I know exactly where you are." She didn't hang up. That was the first decision, and it was instinctive, made before thought caught up. Keep him talking. Keep the line open. Keep him localized to the phone and not to whatever those men outside were being told through their own earpieces. "Cole," she said. "Don't run," he said. "There's nowhere to go. The building's covered on 4 sides and the garage exit is already blocked. I've got 9 men down there and more coming." A pause, and she could hear him breathing, slightly elevated, the particular rhythm of someone who is scared and performing confidence over it. "This doesn't have to get complicated." She was already moving toward the operations table, phone pressed between her ear and shoulder, both hands free. The decryption was at 63%. The secondary terminal showed 4 cameras now: east entrance, north service alley, garage subfloor, and the roof access stairwell. The men on the east feed had reached the service door. They weren't breaking through yet. Waiting for something, a signal, probably. Waiting for Cole to finish the call. "What do you want?" she said. "You know what I want." "The drive." "And you," he said, "in that order." She looked at the decryption bar. 64. 665. "If I give you the drive, you'll just... I'll let you go," he said, and the smoothness of the lie was almost impressive. The practiced quality of it. A man who had said words like that so many times that he'd stopped noticing the gap between the sound and the meaning. "Emery, listen to me. Whatever Graves told you, whatever he's made you think about your situation, he's using you. You're evidence to him. You're a tool." 67%. "Unlike you," she said. A silence. Short and compressed. "I'm the only person in your life who has ever actually known you," Cole said, and the register changed. Softer, the specific softness she remembered from the beginning, before she understood what it was made of. "I'm the only person who..." She put the phone face down on the table. She didn't hang up. She let it run. Let him keep talking into the surface of the table while she moved to the secondary terminal and pulled up the building's internal communication system. Lucien had shown her the basic layout of the screens when they'd first come in. Not extensively, but enough. She found the internal alert channel and typed a single line into it the way she'd seen him do. East entrance, north alley, garage blocked, 9 minimum. She hit send and had no idea if it would reach anyone or just sit in a log somewhere. 70%. She went back to the phone, picked it up. "Not going to be able to protect you the way I..." "Cole," she said. He stopped. "I'm going to give you the drive," she said. "I need 10 minutes. Another silence. She could hear him calculating that the specific quality of it, the way he got quiet when he was deciding whether he was being played. She'd learned to read that silence the hard way. 5, he said. 10, it's not connected to this system yet. I have to locate it. You have it on you. I had it on me. Lucien's people took it when I arrived. I know which system it's in, but it takes... She heard her own voice, even and deliberate, and a distant part of her registered the strangeness of how calm she was, how the fear had not disappeared but had been routed into something operational. 10 minutes, Cole. Or you send your men in, and you get nothing, because when they breach, the system auto-wipes. That's how his setup works. It wasn't. She had no idea if that was true. She said it with enough specificity that it sounded institutional rather than improvised. The silence stretched. 8 minutes, Cole said. Fine. She put the phone down again. Face up this time, watching the timer on the call. 74%. She crossed to the main screens and found the camera that covered the building's primary elevator shaft, not the residential elevator, the service shaft on the north side that ran separately. Empty. She pulled up the roof access camera. Empty. She went back to the east entrance feed. The men were still at the door, still waiting, which meant Cole was still on the phone with her and the signal to breach hadn't been given, which meant she had minutes, and the question was what to do with them that wasn't stand here watching a number climb toward 100. She thought about Lucian. He'd left maybe 40 minutes ago. No way to know where he was, who he was with, what the situation looked like from his end. She had no number for him. He hadn't given her one, and she hadn't asked because at the time it hadn't seemed like the kind of information she'd need in the next 2 hours. She thought about the ledger. Victor's ledger, still sitting on the operations table where Lucian had left it. She crossed to it and opened it and found the page again. The column with the port codes, the shell company abbreviations, and the name. She hadn't recognized it when she'd seen it the first time. She looked at it again now. She still didn't recognize it. But she took out her own phone, the cracked one, the one that had been in her jacket pocket through everything, and photographed the page. Then the next page. Then the one before it. Then she photographed the east entrance camera feed on the secondary terminal, the garage feed, the north alley feed. Documentation. The reflex of someone who'd learned that evidence was the only thing that mattered when the people with authority decided to rewrite what happened. 79%. She heard something. Not from the terminal, not from Cole's open phone line, from the building. A specific vibration in the floor, felt more than heard, the kind that came from below. The garage. She looked at the garage camera feed. The 3 sedans were still there, but one of the men who'd been standing at the north position was no longer visible. She counted. 7. There had been 9 on the east feed, but she'd been watching the east feed and the garage had been peripheral, and now there were 7 men visible across all feeds, and 2 of them were, the elevator tone sounded, not the residential elevator, the service shaft. She grabbed the ledger and the cracked phone and moved to the left side of the room in 3 steps, putting the central table between herself and the elevator door. The service elevator was at the end of the hall. She remembered that. It opened into a utility corridor that connected to the operations room through a secondary door she'd noted but never used. The secondary door was 12 feet to her right. She watched it. The handle moved. She picked up the nearest thing on the table, a tablet, heavy, metal-cased, and held it with both hands and waited, which was not a plan. Which she knew was not a plan, but the distance between the table and the door was 12 feet, and between the door and the window was 30, and outside the window was the 34th floor, so the table was where she was going to be. The door opened. A man she didn't recognize came through fast and low, and behind him a second one, and they were both moving toward her before she'd fully processed the first one, and she threw the tablet not at either of them, but at the light panel on the wall to her left, which she hit by chance more than aim, and half the room went dark. In the dark, she went right instead of back, along the wall, feeling the edge of a secondary cabinet with her hip and using it to orient, and the first man hit the table in the dark with an impact she heard clearly, and the second one was sweeping with a flashlight. The main lights came back. She was at the wrong end of the room. The door to the hall was behind both of them now. The second man had the flashlight in one hand and something else in the other, and he was looking at her with the particular professional absence of expression that meant she was a task to him, not a person, which was in some ways worse than malice. "Don't," she said. He moved anyway. What happened next was not graceful, and it was not what she would have chosen. She went left when she should have gone right, and the thing in his hand turned out to be a taser, and the first probe caught the sleeve of her jacket rather than her arm, and she pulled sideways and it tore free, and in the space that created, she got to the door. She hit the hall running. Behind her, she heard the crash of someone getting up from the table. She didn't look back. The residential elevator was at the end of the hall, and the stairs were opposite, and she took the stairs because the elevator was a box, and she was not getting in a box right now. Down 2 flights, and the stairwell door on 32 opened as she passed it. She caught it in her peripheral vision and kept going and heard footsteps entering above her, which meant they'd anticipated the stairwell, which meant this had more coordination than a rushed operation, which meant Cole had been planning this specific building since at least 30th floor. She stopped, not because she chose to, Because the stairwell door on the 29th floor opened below her and a man stepped in and looked up. She was between floors, one above, two below. Men in the stairwell, now at 29 and somewhere close behind her above. She pushed through the door on 30. The 30th floor was not the penthouse. It was something else. Offices, by the look of it. The kind of spare professional space that appeared in buildings like this as cover infrastructure. Dark. Motion sensor lights clicking on in sequence as she moved through them, which was both useful and terrible. She was halfway across the open floor when her cracked phone buzzed. Unknown number, different unknown than Cole's. She picked up without stopping moving. "Northwest stairwell," said a voice she didn't know. 32nd floor, blue door on the left. "Who is this?" "Someone Lucian called 20 minutes ago when he saw the alert you sent." A pause, businesslike. "Northwest stairwell, now. You have about 90 seconds before they figure out which floor you stopped on." She looked at the motion sensor lights behind her, a trail of illuminated panels marking exactly where she'd been. She found the northwest stairwell. The blue door on the 32nd floor opened into a maintenance corridor that smelled like concrete dust and machine oil. A woman was standing in it, late 30s, compact, dark jacket, carrying a bag with the easy casualness of someone who was used to carrying bags that contained things other than what they appeared to contain. "Emery Vale," the woman said. Not a question. "Yes." "Nora." She turned and started walking. "Don't talk, just follow." They moved through the maintenance corridor for 90 seconds, and then through a fire door and into a parking structure Emery hadn't known existed. Separate from the main garage, accessed through the building's utility infrastructure. Invisible from the street. A single car was running, a gray sedan, nondescript, the kind of car that existed specifically to not be noticed. Nora got in the driver's side. Emery got in the passenger side. They were moving before the door fully closed. "The drive," Nora said. "Decrypting, still in the penthouse." Nora's jaw tightened by a degree. "How far?" 79% when I left. Maybe 2 minutes from completion if the process didn't interrupt." "It interrupted," Nora said. "The system auto-isolates when there's a breach detection. It stops the decryption and locks the output." She navigated out of the parking structure through a service exit that opened onto a side street Emery had never seen, which means the files are locked inside a system that Cole's people are now physically standing next to. Emery sat with this. Can they access it? Not without the key Lucian uses, but they can take the hardware. Nora glanced at her, which means everything on that drive, your files, our files, the third layer manifests, goes with them. The car moved through the early evening streets, normal traffic, nothing to indicate what had just happened in a building 4 blocks behind them. "Where are we going?" Emery said. "To Lucien," Nora said, "which is not where he wanted you to be tonight, but the situation has changed." "Where is he?" Nora looked straight ahead. "That's what I need to tell you," she said. "And you need to hear it before you see him, because when you see him, you're going to want to react, and you can't." Emery turned to look at her profile. "Tell me," she said. Nora drove for 4 seconds in silence. "The name in the ledger," she said. "The person connected to the shell companies. Lucien went to confront them tonight." A pause. "The address he went to. It wasn't where we thought this person was operating from. It was a secondary location, a setup." She paused again, longer. "He walked into it." The city moved past the windows. "Is he alive?" Emery said. "Yes," Nora said. "But they have him." The words landed without softness, the way true things do when there's no good way to arrange them. Emery looked at the street ahead, at the normal moving world of evening traffic and lit storefronts and people who were having ordinary nights. "Who has him?" she said. Nora was quiet for one more beat. "The person from the ledger," she said. "Her name is Cass Vale. She ran financial operations for Lucien's organization for 4 years. She designed the shell company structure that hides his legitimate assets." Another pause. "She also designed the routing system for Mercer's trafficking network, used Lucien's own financial architecture to build it. He never knew because she built it in the negative space of his own systems, in the gaps he trusted her to manage." Emery thought about what Lucien had said in the operations room. Someone who has had access to every significant decision I've made since I restructured the organization. He trusted her, Emery said. More than that, Nora said, and the specific weight of those 3 words told Emery everything she needed to know about what more than that meant without Nora having to say it. They drove in silence for a moment. Where are they holding him? Emery said. A facility at the south end of the Eastport complex, Nora said. Cass has been running a secondary operation out of that location for 2 years. It's registered as a cold storage facility, completely off our radar because she was the one who managed our radar. How many people? Unknown, minimum 12 based on what she could have mobilized in the time she had. Possibly more. She had access to our contractor lists, which means she knows exactly what kind of response we can generate, and she'll have planned for it. And the drive, Emery said. Cole's people have it. If they took the hardware from the penthouse, yes. Which means Cass gets the decrypted files. Nora glanced at her. Explain. Cole is connected to Cass, Emery said. That's how he knew the building address. She gave it to him. She's been inside Lucian's security systems. She knew which building, which floor, which access points. Cole's operation tonight wasn't his. He doesn't have that kind of reach. It was hers, run through him. She heard herself say it and felt the pieces lock into position with the particular cold clarity of something that had been true all along and was only now visible. Mercer and Cass. They've been coordinating. The trafficking network, the port operations, the shell companies. She built the financial side and he provided the enforcement, the badge. Nora was quiet. You got there faster than Lucien did, she said. Lucien was too close to her, Emery said. He kept looking for reasons the evidence was wrong. Another silence. Yes, Nora said. They turned south. The Eastport complex was visible in the distance, the massive crane arms of the port terminals lit against the darkening sky, the waterfront industrial corridor stretching along the river. We can't go in with a full response team, Nora said. She'll expect that. She has counters for it. She designed them. If we come in with numbers, Lucien's the first thing that stops existing. So we go small, Emery said. We go small, and we go smart, and we go with the one thing she doesn't know we have, Nora said. What's that? Nora glanced at her again. You, she said. She doesn't know about you. She knows Lucien pulled someone out of an alley. She doesn't know how much you know, what you've seen, what Lucien told you. You're the only variable in this that she hasn't accounted for. Emery looked at the port complex growing larger in the windshield. I'm not trained for this, she said. I know, Nora said. I'm a bartender who stole a flash drive. I know that too, Nora said. But you got out of a penthouse that 9 armed men were trying to lock down, and you did it in under 4 minutes, and you documented the ledger before you ran. She paused. Trained people freeze. Untrained people who are angry and paying attention sometimes don't. Emery thought about Sasha Rell, about the manifest number next to her partial name, about a port code, EPC-7, appearing in a ledger that a woman named Cass Vale had designed. She thought about Lucien in a cold storage facility at the south end of the Eastport complex, and about what they have him meant coming from a person who clearly did not use words imprecisely. She thought about the drive, about 79%, about 2 minutes from completion and everything on it. The 27 women, the shell companies, the manifests, Sasha's name, locked inside hardware that was now in the hands of the people it was supposed to destroy. What do you need me to do? She said. Nora reached into the bag on the back seat without taking her eyes off the road and produced a small radio, a folded paper, and a photograph. She set the photograph on the center console. A woman, professional headshot, the kind taken at corporate events, mid-40s, sharp-featured, with the particular composed expression of someone who had learned to make authority look like calm. That's Cass Vale, Nora said. Study it. Because when you see her in person, you're not going to react. You're not going to show her anything. She paused. And you are going to see her in person. That's the plan. Emery picked up the photograph. She looked at the face of the woman who had built a trafficking network in the shadow of a man's trust. who had moved 27 women through port corridors registered to someone else's company, who had used 4 years of proximity and access and the specific power of being believed to construct something that had destroyed people she would never have to look at. Emery had spent 8 months learning what it looked like when someone did that at close range, on a personal scale, with one person. This was the same thing at a different size. She set the photograph down. "Tell me the plan," she said. Nora told her. It was not a good plan. It had too many points of failure, and it depended on variables that couldn't be controlled, and the margin for error was thin enough that calling it a margin was being generous. But it was the plan they had, and the alternative was waiting for a response team to be assembled and coordinated. And Cass Vale knew exactly how long that took because she had written the coordination protocols. They were 4 minutes from the port entrance when Emery's cracked phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. But not the same unknown as before. 4 words. She has the drive. No signature. No context. The number, when she looked at it, matched nothing in her contacts. She showed it to Nora. Nora looked at it. Her expression didn't change much, but her hand shifted on the wheel. "Lucienne," she said. "He's texting from inside." "They're not holding him completely dark then," Nora said, and the tone of it suggested this was both better and worse than the alternative. Better because he was alive and communicating, worse because it meant Cass wanted him to communicate, which meant she was using him for something, feeding information in a direction she controlled. "She let him send that," Emery said. "Yes," Nora said. "Why?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "Because she wants you to know she has everything," Nora said. "The drive. Lucienne. The decrypted files. She wants you to know you've lost." She paused. "She's telling you to run." Emery looked at the port complex through the windshield, at the crane arms and the loading lights and the dark buildings of the cold storage corridor along the south waterfront. She thought about running. She measured it against everything else. Then she folded the photograph of Cass Vale and put it in her jacket pocket, next to the place where the drive used to be. "How close can you get me to the south entrance without being seen?" she said. Nora checked her mirrors. "Close enough," she said. The car turned off the main road and into the industrial corridor, moving without lights through a stretch of dark access road that ran parallel to the waterfront, and Emery watched the buildings slide past and felt something happening in her chest that she didn't have a precise word for. Not courage, which always sounded too clean, and not the absence of fear, which she had in abundance. Something more like the decision to be afraid and go anyway. The understanding that some things mattered more than the outcome of being careful. Sasha's name in a manifest. 27. Lucien, somewhere in a cold storage building, sending 4 words through a phone he'd been allowed to keep because someone wanted her to run. The car stopped. 200 meters, Nora said. South entrance is the loading dock on the left. There's a secondary entrance through the cold storage annex. It's not on any official layout, but Lucien had it flagged in our system 2 months ago when we first started looking at this facility. She handed Emery the radio. Channel 3. I'll be close. Emery got out of the car. The night air smelled like salt water and diesel and cold metal, and the port was loud in the specific industrial way of large machinery at low operation. The groan of cranes, the hydraulic sigh of loading equipment, the water against pylons. She walked toward the loading dock. 200 meters. She counted her steps. At 160, she saw the first guard. At 175, she saw the second. And at 180, she saw the thing that stopped her mid-step and turned the plan, the already thin, already improvised plan, into something else entirely. Victor. Standing at the south entrance door with a radio in his hand, talking to a guard she didn't recognize, in the posture of someone who belonged there. Not detained, not coerced, standing there like he'd arrived, like he'd known where to be. She pressed herself against the side of a shipping container and put her back to the corrugated steel and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, which was all she allowed herself. And in those 3 seconds, she understood what she was actually looking at. Victor hadn't brought the ledger to Lucien out of loyalty. He'd brought it to tell Cass exactly what Lucien now knew, and what he didn't. He'd handed them the ledger like evidence and walked out of the penthouse and driven directly here. And what Lucien had read in those pages, and what he'd decided to do about it had traveled ahead of him through Victor's phone, and the address Lucian had gone to confront Cass Vale had been given to him through Victor, and the setup that was waiting at that address had been prepared because Victor had told them he was coming. 4 years of trust, 2 betrayals, not one. She opened her eyes. The radio in her hand was set to channel 3. She thought about pressing the transmit button and telling Nora what she'd just seen. She thought about what Nora would say, which was probably pull back and we reassess, which was the correct tactical response to discovering that the threat assessment had been wrong by a significant factor. She thought about Lucien inside that building, about the specific look on his face in the operations room when he'd read the ledger and understood that someone close had betrayed him, the way he'd gone very still, the grief routed through something cold. She thought, he walked in there already knowing it was bad. He walked in knowing someone he trusted had sold 27 people and used his name to do it. He went anyway. She looked at Victor's back 30 meters away. She put the radio in her pocket without pressing transmit, and she started looking for another. She found the other way in through a gap she almost missed. The cold storage annex ran parallel to the main facility along the south waterfront, separated from the primary loading dock by a narrow service corridor wide enough for a single forklift and nothing else. The wall of the annex was corrugated steel painted the particular industrial gray of things that weren't meant to be looked at, and at the far end of the corridor set into the wall at a height that suggested it had been added after the original construction, was a door with no exterior handle, just a keypad and a magnetic seal and a thin line of light at the bottom that meant it was in active use. Lucien had flagged this entrance, Nora had said 2 months ago, which meant the keypad code was either in a system Emery didn't have access to, or it was something Lucien had noted somewhere and she had no way of knowing where. She stood in the service corridor and looked at the keypad and thought about what she knew about how Lucien operated, the palm scan and code on the penthouse elevator, the way his security was layered in redundancies, the way he kept things simple at the access level because complexity at the point of entry created delays under pressure. She thought about the penthouse room code, the one he'd given her, 071111. She looked at the keypad. It was worth 4 seconds. She typed it. The magnetic seal released. She stood in the open doorway for a half second, stunned and not showing it, and then she was through and the door closed behind her with a soft mechanical click. The interior of the annex was cold enough to see her breath. Industrial refrigeration units ran along both walls, their compressors producing a low constant hum that filled the space and swallowed smaller sounds, footsteps, breathing, the soft movement of careful people. The ceiling was high and fitted with wire cage fluorescents that gave off a flat blue-white light with no shadow relief. Everything was visible and nothing was warm. She moved along the left wall, staying close to the refrigeration units, using the compressor hum as cover. The annex was maybe 40 meters long and she could see the far end. A set of double doors, reinforced, with a wire glass window set at head height. Through the window, light. She moved toward it. At 20 meters, she heard voices. Not through the double doors, above her. A metal catwalk ran the length of the annex ceiling, accessed by a ladder bolted to the right wall. 2 men up there, talking in the low, efficient shorthand of people on a long shift. She stopped and pressed against a refrigeration unit and listened and counted the intervals between their words and figured they were walking the catwalk in a slow patrol pattern, east to west, west to east, maybe 90 seconds per pass. She waited for east, moved at the turn. She covered the remaining 20 meters in the pause between passes and reached the double doors and looked through the wire glass. A corridor. Lit. 2 more doors on the left side, one at the far end. A guard standing at the far door with his back to the corridor, facing whatever was on the other side. 1 guard she could see. She had no weapon. She had a radio on channel 3 that she hadn't used. She had a cracked phone with photographs of a ledger and a battery at 31%. She thought, this is an absolutely terrible position. Then she thought about 79% on a decryption bar and 4 words sent through a phone Cass Vale had let Lucien keep. She thought, she let him keep the phone. She pulled out the cracked phone and typed a message to the number that had sent she has the drive. Short, specific. No preamble. Annex, double doors, north corridor. 1 guard visible at far door. How many rooms? She watched the screen. 7 seconds. 3. I'm in the middle one. 2 with me. Armed. Then after 2 more seconds, don't. She stared at that last word. Then she typed, how many total in facility? 8 seconds. 11. Victor coordinating. Cass is in the East room with the hardware. The hardware, the drive. The decrypted files at whatever percentage the system had reached before it locked. East room from your position, she typed. Opposite end of corridor from you. She looked through the wire glass again. The guard at the far door. Far door was east. Cass was behind that door with the drive and whatever the decryption had produced. Lucien was in the middle room. 2 guards with him, armed. She was on the wrong side of a set of double doors with no weapon and no backup, and the only person who knew where she was had told her don't. She pressed the transmit button on the radio. Channel 3, she said, barely above a whisper. I'm inside the annex. South double doors, north corridor. Lucien is in the middle room, 2 guards. Cass is in the east room. I need a distraction on the exterior north face in 90 seconds. Loud. Static. 3 seconds. Nora's voice. Define loud. Something that makes the guard at the far door move toward the north exterior. Another pause. 60 seconds, Nora said. Emery put the radio away and looked at the guard through the wire glass and counted her breathing and waited. At 58 seconds, the sound came. Not an explosion. Smarter than that. A vehicle impact, the particular concussive crunch of a collision against the north exterior wall, followed immediately by an alarm from somewhere on that side of the building, the kind of compound industrial alert that demanded investigation and generated radio chatter and moved people whether they wanted to move or not. The guard at the far door turned his head. His radio crackled. He moved toward the north end of the corridor, away from the east door, covering distance in quick professional steps. Emery was through the double doors before he'd taken 6. She went straight to the middle door. No handle on this one either. A bolt, exterior, which meant they'd locked it from the corridor side, which meant the 2 men inside with Lucien were on the wrong side of a lock they couldn't operate, which was either a security measure or Cass keeping her assets contained, and either way, it was the first thing that had gone right since the penthouse. She threw the bolt. She opened the door and went in fast and low. The room was maybe 5 meters by 5 meters, a former refrigerated storage unit with the cooling element stripped out, and it was cold and lit by a single overhead light and smelled like concrete and blood. A metal chair in the center. A man in it. Lucien. Wrists secured behind the chair back. A cut above his right eye that had bled significantly down the side of his face and dried. His shirt torn at the left shoulder, a bruise spreading from his collarbone toward his neck. He was upright, head level, breathing through his nose with the controlled steadiness of someone managing pain through discipline rather than the absence of it. The 2 guards were flanking him, and they turned when she came in. The one on the left moved first. She'd crossed half the distance to the chair before he fully registered what she was doing, and in the narrowness of the room there was no space for tactical positioning. It was just collision and outcome and the specific leverage of someone who knew she had one chance. She came in from his right side and used the door frame behind her as a brace and hit his arm with both of hers before he got the weapon level, driving it down and to the left. And the shot that discharged hit the concrete floor, and the sound of it in an enclosed, refrigerated room was enormous. The second guard grabbed her from behind. She went limp instead of fighting it, dead weight, sudden, not what he expected. And he adjusted his grip, and in the adjustment, she got one arm free and drove her elbow backward twice, short and hard, and his grip broke on the second one. She hit the floor, got up. The first guard was bringing the weapon back up. Lucien moved. His wrists were secured, but his legs weren't, and he drove both feet into the back of the first guard's knees from behind with a force that came from a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of small opening. The guard went down forward. The weapon skittered across the floor. The second guard was reaching for his own holster. Emery got to the skittered weapon first. She didn't shoot. She held it and looked at the second guard and said, "Don't." He stopped. His eyes moved to the weapon and then to her face and then back to the weapon, doing the math, and whatever he found in her expression apparently resolved the equation in a particular direction because he put both hands up. The first guard on the floor was trying to get up. "Stay." Lucien said from the chair, with the particular authority of someone whose voice alone had historically been sufficient, and the guard on the floor reconsidered. Emery crossed to Lucien. The restraints were zip ties, heavy gauge, doubled. She looked at the weapon in her hand, looked at the ties. "Angle it," Lucien said. "Right side. Between the tie and the chair back." She did it the way he described, and it took 2 attempts, and then the plastic split, and his hands came free, and he spent 3 seconds just pressing his palms flat against his thighs, restoring circulation, his jaw tight with the effort of not reacting to whatever that felt like. Then he stood up. He was taller than she'd remembered, or the room was smaller, and there was blood drying on the right side of his face, and his left shoulder was sitting wrong, and he looked at her with an expression she didn't have a word for, something between what she'd expected and something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with the specific fact of her being here in it. "I told you not to," he said. "I heard you," she said. He took the weapon from her hand and secured the 2 guards in the chair with their own zip ties and the restraints from the wall, efficient and fast despite the shoulder. And when he turned back to her, his face had gone into the operational mode she recognized, the one where everything ran cold and forward, and personal things got filed under later. "How many does Nora have outside?" he said. "I don't know. She caused the distraction, but I don't know with what." "Victor?" "At the south entrance when I came in. He's coordinating for Cass." Something moved through his expression, short, controlled, gone. "East room," he said. "Yes." He went to the door and looked into the corridor. The guard she'd diverted was still gone. She could hear the radio chatter from the north side of the building, still active, the distraction still running. The corridor was empty. He moved into it. She followed. They covered the corridor in 12 seconds, staying close to the left wall, and at the east door Lucien stopped and put his back to the wall beside the frame and looked at her. "She'll have the hardware set to wipe on forced entry," he said, low. "Can she wipe the decrypted output if it's already been transferred somewhere?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The system was at 79% when I left," she said. "It auto-locked on breach detection, but if any portion of the output was cached to a secondary location before the lock, the system caches to an off-site server at every 10% interval," Lucien said slowly. 70% cache would have gone through at... He stopped, looked at the door. "At 70%, she has manifests, shell company records, and port logs. Not the names, not the third-layer personal identifiers." He paused. "But enough. Enough for a federal case," Emery said. "Enough to start one." He looked at her. "You photographed the ledger." "Before I ran, on my phone." Something in his face moved. "Then we don't need the hardware," he said. "We need Cass unable to deny what the hardware contains." Emery understood what he meant. "You want her to open the door herself," she said. "I want her to open the door because she thinks she's winning," Lucien said. "Which she does, because she let me keep the phone and she tracked what I sent and she knows you're in the building because Victor saw you at the exterior and reported it, which means she is currently waiting for the moment she thinks she has us both contained." He looked at the door. "Give her that moment," he said. Emery looked at him, at the blood on his face and the shoulder sitting wrong and the absolute cold steadiness behind his eyes. "You're going to let her take the position," she said. "I'm going to let her think she has it," he said, for about 4 minutes. He reached into his torn shirt pocket and produced his phone, still there because Cass had wanted it there, and typed something and sent it. Then he looked at Emery. "Get behind the refrigeration units on the left side," he said. "Don't move until you hear me say her name." She moved. The refrigeration units in the east corridor were larger than the annex units, floor-to-ceiling industrial cold storage cabinets bolted to the wall. She pressed in between 2 of them, 6 feet from the door, angle-blind to anyone coming out, but with a clear line to the corridor beyond. She heard Lucien's footsteps stop. She heard him sit down. The specific sound of controlled descent, a man lowering himself to the floor with a bad shoulder and not letting it show in his breathing. She heard him say, loud enough to carry through the door, "She's not coming." A pause. Then from behind the east door, a voice, Cass Vale's voice was not what Emery had expected from the corporate headshot. It was lower, unhurried, with a quality of amusement that wasn't warm. The amusement of someone watching events confirm a long-held assessment of human predictability. "Of course she came," Cass said from behind the door. "I counted on it. So did you, which is why you sent the text." A pause. "Open the door, Cass," Lucian said. "In a moment." A beat. "I want to tell you something first. I want to tell you because you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if I felt anything, and I'd rather you didn't waste the time. I felt something. 4 years of something." Another beat, and the amusement dropped out, replaced by something more precise. "But you built an organization on the principle that every asset has a function, and every function has a cost, Lucien." Yen. "You taught me that. I just applied it more broadly than you intended." Silence. "The women," Lucien said. 27. 29, Cass said. "You missed 2 in the earlier manifests. Your analyst pulled the wrong date range." The number sat in the corridor. Emery's hands were flat against the cold steel of the refrigeration unit, and she could feel her own heartbeat in her palms. "Open the door," Lucien said. And the tone was different now. Not a request and not a command. Something that didn't have a normal category. Something that had shed everything except the fact of itself. 3 seconds of silence. The door opened. Cass Vale came out the way Emery had expected from the photograph. Composed, unhurried, a tablet in her left hand, a small frame pistol held low in her right. She was in dark clothing, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked exactly like the kind of person who had spent 4 years inside someone's trust. She looked at Lucian on the floor. She looked at the corridor. She didn't see Emery. "Where is she?" Cass said. "Gone," Lucian said. "She ran when she saw Victor. I told her to." Cass looked at him for a long moment, doing the assessment, the specific calculation of someone who was good at reading situations and knew it. "You're lying," she said. But it was 40% certainty and 60% question, and Emery could hear that ratio from 6 feet away. "I'm sitting on the floor of a corridor with a separated shoulder," Lucien said. "I don't have the operational bandwidth to lie right now." Cass looked down the corridor again. Her posture was controlled, but her weight was on her forward foot, which was the posture of someone expecting movement from a specific direction and orienting to it, and she was oriented east toward the double doors away from the refrigeration units on the left. "Stand up," Cass said. "In a moment. Now, Lucien." He stood, slowly, using the wall, making the shoulder visible, and it was genuine, and it was also deliberate, showing her the injury, giving her the specific satisfaction of what the injury meant about the power differential. Emery watched Cass's posture and saw her settle into it, the forward weight shifting back, the gun hand relaxing by a degree. Comfortable. "The hardware goes with me," Cass said. "You and the bartender become a problem that resolves itself once I'm out of the country. I'm not going to insult you with a negotiation about it." "No," Lucian said. "No isn't a current option." "The 70% cash went off-site 40 minutes ago," Lucian said. "It's sitting in 3 federal repositories under a submission protocol that auto-escalates if it doesn't receive a cancellation code and—" He paused and looked at his watch, which Emery noticed he wasn't actually wearing. 31 minutes. Cass looked at him. "You're bluffing," she said. "The 70% cash contains shell company records with your name in the formation documents," Lucian said. "Your real name. Not the operating alias. The one on your original identification that you used when you first came to work for me before you established the layers." He paused. "You made one mistake in the financial architecture. You used your real identification for the first layer because you weren't planning the exit yet. By the time you were, the foundation layer was already load-bearing, and you couldn't remove it without collapsing the whole structure." Cass's weight shifted, just a degree, back onto her rear foot. Emery watched it. "The submission protocol is real," Lucian said. "The cancellation code is in my phone, which you let me keep because you wanted to track what I sent to the bartender, and while you were tracking that, I was doing something else." "You didn't have time. I had the time on the drive to the address you fed through Victor," Lucian said. 22 minutes. I used 18 of them." The silence in the corridor had a different quality now. Emery could feel it even behind the refrigeration unit. The shift in atmospheric pressure of a situation changing polarity. Cass's gun hand was still low, but the knuckles had gone white. "You're going to give me the code," Cass said. "No," Lucien said. "I will." "You need me alive to give you the code," Lucien said. "Which means you need to be cooperative, which means this," he indicated the pistol, "is decorative at this point. You're welcome to use it. The code dies with me, and in 30 minutes you're in every federal system on the eastern seaboard under your real name, with documentation connecting you to 29 trafficking victims." Cass looked at him, and then she laughed. It was a short sound, almost appreciative, and it was the most frightening thing Emery had heard in 2 days of frightening things, because it was the laugh of someone who had a remaining option. "Victor," Cass said, not loudly. Footsteps from the west end of the corridor. Victor coming through the double doors, radio in hand, seeing Lucien against the wall and stopping. "Find the girl," Cass said. Victor's eyes moved across the corridor. He looked at the refrigeration units. Emery looked back at him through the 3-inch gap between 2 units. She watched him decide, and in the 2 seconds before he spoke, she understood that whatever Victor was, whatever combination of loyalty and calculation and fear had brought him to this corridor on this side of this situation, he was looking at her the same way she was looking at him, like someone taking the final measurement of a choice they'd already half made and couldn't entirely take back. Victor keyed his radio. "Exterior team," he said. "North position. I need—" The east wall of the annex came in. Not an explosion. A vehicle. A heavy vehicle moving at significant speed through corrugated steel, and the sound was enormous and structural, and the overhead fluorescents swung on their mounts, and one of them burst, and the corridor went half dark in an instant. And in the dust and the swinging light and the shriek of tearing metal, the situation in the corridor ceased to be a controlled negotiation and became something else. Emery moved. She came out from between the refrigeration units in the half-dark and covered the distance to Cass in the time it took Cass to turn toward the wall impact, and she hit her from the left. Not a train tackle, not a controlled takedown, just the raw mass of a person who had run out of options, deciding that forward was the only available direction. They hit the floor together. The pistol went one direction. The tablet went another. Cass was stronger than she looked and faster than Emery had calculated, and what followed was not a fight in any technical sense. It was 2 people on a corridor floor with no space and no protocol, and Emery was smaller and had not slept enough and had not eaten enough, and was running on something that was not exactly adrenaline but was adjacent to it, the specific fuel of a person who had been afraid for too long and had run out of the capacity to keep being only afraid. She got Cass's right arm, got the wrist, put her weight on it. "Stop," she said. "Stop!" Cass didn't stop. She rolled and got leverage, and Emery lost the wrist and took an elbow to the cheekbone that was white and specific and turned her vision gray at the edges for 3 full seconds. She did not let go. She had both hands on Cass's left arm now, and she was on her knees, and the gray at the edges of her vision was retreating, and she heard Lucien's voice saying something sharp, and then a sound she recognized, a controlled impact, brief, and Cass went still. Emery sat back on her heels. Lucien was standing over them. He'd used his right arm. His left was hanging at the shoulder in a way that made her want to look away, but she didn't. He looked down at her. "Are you hurt?" he said. Her cheek was swelling. She could feel it. "I'm fine." "You're not fine." "I'm functional," she said. "That's different." He looked at her for 1 second, just one, compressed and specific, and then he looked up. The wall impact had opened a gap 3 meters wide in the east face of the annex. Through the dust and the half-dark, she could see a truck, the kind used for port freight, its cab embedded in the steel. Nora was through the gap before the dust settled, 2 men behind her, moving with the efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this signal and had a list of tasks and were working it. Victor was on the floor. She hadn't seen him go down. He was conscious, looking at the ceiling, one hand pressed against his side. Not shot. He'd gone down in the initial impact, thrown by the wall effect. He looked at Nora crouching next to him, and then he looked at the ceiling again, and his expression was the expression of a man taking the full measure of every decision that had led him to a cold storage corridor floor. Cass was restrained in under 30 seconds. The tablet had landed against the baseboard. Emery got to it before Nora's people did. The screen was cracked but running, and on it was the drive interface and the decryption bar, and it was still locked at 79%, which meant the files were still inside, which meant they were one cancellation code and one unlocked system away from everything. She looked at Lucien. He crossed to her and looked at the screen and reached past her and entered a sequence into the tablet with his right hand, slow and deliberate because his right hand was also not entirely functional. The lock released. The decryption bar moved. 80%, 85, 90. The processor was clearing the queue that had backed up, pushing through the remaining layers in sequence, and the numbers climbed and she watched them and did not breathe quite correctly until the bar hit 100 and the screen changed. A directory. Files. A long list with codes and names and manifests and records, and in the third subdirectory, the one labeled with the EPC7 port code, a file that when she opened it showed names, real names, full names, 29 of them. The third name on the list was Sasha Rell. Emery looked at it. She didn't say anything. She just looked at it, at the name that had been buried in a manifest between cargo codes for 2 years, and something happened in her chest that wasn't grief exactly and wasn't relief exactly, but existed in the specific territory between them where things go when they've been carried too long and finally get set down. Lucien was watching her face. She looked up. "It's all here," she said. He nodded once. "Send it," he said. She found Solis's contact in the cracked phone, the journalist, the person she'd been trying to reach the night she accidentally sent her location to the wrong number. 8 months ago, that number had been a last resort. Tonight, it was the first call. She attached the directory export, all of it, shell companies, manifests, names, financial records, the ledger photographs, the port codes, the formation documents with Cass Vale's real name in the first layer. She hit send. Then she sent it to 2 federal addresses that Lucien read out from memory, flat and precise. Then she put the tablet down on the concrete floor of a cold storage annex on the south edge of the Eastport complex and looked at the gap in the wall where the night air was coming through, carrying the smell of salt water and diesel and the particular cold of a waterfront in late evening, and she breathed it. Behind her, Nora was directing her people. Cass was being moved. Victor was sitting up with his hand still pressed to his side and his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance that didn't correspond to anything visible. Lucien came and stood next to her at the wall gap. He was holding his left arm against his torso with his right hand, a careful containment of the shoulder, and the blood on his face had dried brown, and there was a new cut on his right forearm she hadn't noticed before, and he looked like someone who had come a significant distance through difficult terrain and was not yet ready to stop moving. They stood at the gap together for a moment, looking out at the port, at the crane arms and the water and the normal industrial continuity of it all. "Solis will publish," she said. "Yes." "How long before the federal response?" "With what we sent. 24 hours. Maybe less." He paused. "The submission protocol I told Cass about." She looked at him. "Was it real?" she said. He was quiet for 2 seconds. "The 18 minutes on the drive," he said. "I did use them." A pause. "Some of them." She looked at his profile, at the dried blood and the controlled damage and the absolute absence of performance in his expression. "Some of them," she said. "I also spent 4 of them thinking about the code I'd have to enter to stop it," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite an admission and not quite a confession, something that existed in the specific register of a man who had been prepared to make an irreversible choice and wanted her to know that, without knowing exactly why he wanted her to know. She understood what he was saying. He'd set the protocol and then sat in a vehicle for 4 minutes, considering whether he would actually cancel it if it came to that. Whether he was willing to burn everything, the evidence, the case, the names, all of it, to get out. He'd decided he wasn't. She looked back at the water. "The shoulder," she said. "Separated. It's managed. It needs a hospital. It needs 30 minutes and the right person," he said. "Same result." Behind them, Nora said his name. He turned, and Emery turned with him, back into the cold light and the aftermath of the annex. And the thing she saw when she turned was Victor standing up from the floor on his own. Standing up and looking directly at Lucien. The two men looked at each other across the width of the corridor. Victor's radio was on the floor. His hands were at his sides. He had the expression of a man who had run a calculation all the way to its conclusion and found the conclusion worse than the calculation. The ledger was real, Victor said. I know, Lucien said. I brought it to you. After you brought it to her first, Lucien said. After you told her what you'd shown me and where I was going. He paused. You thought bringing me the ledger made it even, one act canceling the other. Victor looked at the floor. How long? Lucien said. Victor didn't answer. How long, Victor? 14 months, Victor said to the floor. She came to me 14 months ago. She had documentation, things I'd done, things from before your organization, before the restructuring, things that would have... He stopped. She had leverage. You could have come to me, Lucien said. You would have... I would have handled it, Lucien said, and the certainty in it was not an accusation, which was somehow worse. You've known me for 20 years. You know that. Victor looked up. His face was doing something complicated, and not all of it was shame. Some of it was the expression of a man who had spent 14 months telling himself the story of why he had no choice and had just heard it contradicted clearly and simply and without anger. Nora stepped forward. Victor didn't resist. Emery watched them take him out through the wall gap into the port night, and she watched the space where he'd been standing and thought about 14 months, about leverage, about the specific mechanism of coercion, the way it found the thing a person needed to protect and put a hand around it and held, not tightly, just enough, until the person had made enough accommodations that the leverage itself was no longer necessary. She knew that mechanism. She knew it from 8 months of a different version of the same thing. She looked at Lucien. He was watching the wall gap. His jaw was set. The operational stillness was intact, but there were fractures in it now. Fine ones. The kind you only saw if you'd been watching the surface long enough to know what it looked like at rest. Come on, she said. He looked at her. The shoulder, she said, and your face, and whatever else. She looked at his right arm. And that. He looked down at his right arm as if noticing the cut there for the first time, which she suspected was genuinely true. There's a car outside, he said. I know, she said. Let's go. They walked toward the wall gap together, through the cold fluorescent light and the dust still settling from the vehicle impact. And as they cleared the gap and stepped out into the port night, the salt air hit her face, and she felt the swelling in her cheekbone sharpen into something more specific and real. Her phone showed 4 missed calls from an unknown number that wasn't Cole and wasn't Nora. She'd look at it in the car. She'd look at everything in the car. The sent confirmation from Solis, the federal acknowledgement, the directory files, the name in the 3rd subdirectory that she wasn't finished with yet, that had more work attached to it, more people to find, more of the 29 to locate. But right now she was standing outside in the cold with the man she'd accidentally sent her location to, and he was looking at the water with his right hand holding his left arm and his face a map of the last 6 hours, and somewhere behind them in a cold storage corridor, Cass Vale was being secured by people who would ensure she didn't disappear into the kind of legal gap that men like Mercer had spent careers manufacturing. Lucien turned and looked at her. In the port light, with the water behind him and the crane arms dark against the sky, he looked like someone who had just run out of the thing that had been keeping him moving and hadn't yet decided what to replace it with. You sent the files, he said. Before I came in, 70% cash. He looked at her for a moment. I told you not to come, he said. You did, she said. You came anyway. I did, she said. He looked at her, and she looked back, and the thing between them and the cold port air was not small and not comfortable and had no clean name, but it had weight, the specific weight of things that accumulate between people who have been in genuinely terrible situations together and have not, despite everything, managed to make the situations worse. His hand, the right one, the functional one, moved. It found her face. Careful. The undamaged side away from the swelling cheekbone, and he held it there for a moment in the particular way of someone who has not touched many things carefully and is making a deliberate effort to do so now. She put her hand over his. Behind them, somewhere in the building, a sound she didn't recognize. They both turned. The East Room was lit differently now, the lights inside cycling in the specific pattern of active system response, which meant the file transfer she'd initiated was still running, cascading out through the submission protocol to the 3 federal repositories. And on the port network, it was probably visible as a significant data event, which meant someone somewhere was going to notice it, which meant the window they had to be not standing in this location was. They moved. Lucien said car, and Nora was already pulling the vehicle around the south edge of the facility before he finished the word, the headlights cutting through the port fog in 2 flat beams. And Emery got in the back and Lucien got in beside her, and the door closed, and they were moving before the data cascade in the East Room had finished whatever it was doing to whatever systems were watching. She looked back through the rear window. The annex was lit from inside, the gap in the east wall throwing orange light across the loading dock concrete, and she could see 2 of Nora's people at the perimeter, and beyond them the dark shapes of the crane arms against the sky, and beyond that the river, moving. Then the car turned, and it was gone. Lucien was on his phone, not texting. A call, low and rapid, the language of someone issuing instructions to people who already understood the context and needed only the specifics. She caught fragments, a location, a time window, something about the federal submission confirmation, which apparently existed, which meant the 18 minutes in the car had produced something real after all. When he hung up, he sat back and put the phone on his knee and looked at the roof of the car for a moment with the expression of someone who has just put down something very heavy and is assessing the damage to their hands. The acknowledgement came through, he said, from the federal repositories. All 3. Time-stamped 14 minutes ago. He paused. By morning, there will be investigators at the port complex. By tomorrow night, warrants. He turned his head against the headrest and looked at her. Cass's legal architecture will hold for approximately 72 hours before it starts collapsing. She knows this, which is why she'll try to leverage the next 12 hours for something. What can she leverage? Victor, he said. Her knowledge of my operations, people she has documentation on. He paused. She's been collecting insurance for 4 years. That's what 4 years of access buys you. Enough insurance to negotiate with. His jaw tightened. It won't be enough, but it'll complicate things. Complicate how? He looked at the window. My organization's legitimate transition has been in process for 8 months, he said. The security, shipping, and real estate infrastructure is clean, auditable, but there are legacy elements that Cass knows about, operations from before the restructuring that I've been winding down. She has documentation on 3 of them. He paused. She'll use those as leverage in a federal negotiation. Trade what she knows about my past operations for reduced exposure on the trafficking charges. Emery looked at him. Will it work? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Partially, he said. The trafficking charges are too documented, too complete. She won't walk on those, but the legacy exposure. He stopped, chose words. There are people connected to those operations who are now legitimate. Families, people who got out. If Cass puts names on a federal table, some of those people get pulled back in. He looked at his hands. That's what she knows she has. That's the real leverage. The car moved through the port district and onto the elevated connector road, and the city opened up on both sides, the lights of it endless and indifferent and continuing. What will you do? Emery said. He turned to look at her. I'll do what I should have done 8 months ago when I started the restructuring, he said. I'll go first, put it on the table myself before she does. Take the exposure voluntarily. A pause. It changes the calculus. If I come forward with the legacy information on my own terms, in coordination with the federal case we just handed them, the framing is different. I'm a cooperating source, not a target. He paused. It costs something, but it costs less than letting her control the narrative. Emery thought about this. It costs you the legacy protection, she said, the things you built around the people who got out. Some of it, he said. Not all. I've had attorneys working on a protection framework for 6 weeks, anticipating exactly this kind of contingency. He looked at her. I've known this moment was coming since I started the restructuring. I just didn't know it would come this fast or from this direction. She looked at him. At the shoulder he was still holding carefully, the dried blood on his face, the cut on his right forearm. You've been planning this exit for 8 months, she said. Yes. Before I sent you my location by accident. Long before, he said. She thought about that. About the version of Lucian Graves she hadn't known 3 days ago. The one who had already been quietly dismantling the thing he'd built, month by month, operation by operation, before a bartender with a stolen flash drive accidentally texted him from a wet alley. Why? She said. He looked at the window again. She thought he wasn't going to answer. He was quiet long enough that she'd started to accept the silence when he spoke. Because I got tired, he said. Not of the work, of the weight of it, of what it required me to be. A pause. I've been running this organization since I was 26 years old. The things I did to build it, the things I did to keep it, they're not things you put down easily, but they're also not things you want to still be carrying at 40. He looked at his hands. I don't have a family. I don't have people outside this. I have an organization and a reputation and a city full of people who don't know my name but live differently because of decisions I made. He paused. That's not nothing, but it's also not enough. At some point it stops being enough. The car was on the bridge now, crossing the river, the water dark and wide below them. The shelters, Emery said. She'd seen the funding documentation in Mercer's files. Anonymous donations to 3 abuse survivor facilities in the city, the financial routing pointing back to a holding company she'd recognized from Lucien's legitimate infrastructure. You've been funding them for 2 years. He didn't confirm or deny. I saw it in the files, she said. Mercer was tracking your legitimate operations and the shelter funding appeared in his surveillance documents. He thought it was a laundering mechanism. He spent 4 months trying to prove it and couldn't because it wasn't. A pause. He couldn't prove it, Lucian said, because it was just money going where it was supposed to go. She looked at him. Why shelters? She said. He looked at the water below the bridge. Because I knew what was moving through those ports, he said. I didn't know the specific operations. I didn't know Cass had built her network in my infrastructure, but I knew what that corridor of the city produced, what it generated in terms of human cost. He paused. The shelters weren't absolution. I don't believe in absolution for certain things. They were just something concrete, something that existed in the physical world that hadn't existed before. He paused. 300 women in 2 years have used those facilities. That's a number I can point to. Emery sat with that. She thought about Sasha Rell's name in a port manifest. She thought about the 29 names in the third layer directory, and the 11 who'd been located in the 3 weeks before tonight, and the others who were still somewhere in a world that had moved them like cargo. She thought about what it meant to fund shelters while the thing that made shelters necessary was operating inside your own infrastructure, undetected, for 14 months. She didn't know what it meant. She wasn't sure it resolved cleanly into anything, but she understood that it was true, which was different from it being simple. The car arrived at a building she hadn't seen before, a private medical facility in the Upper District, the kind that existed specifically for people who needed skilled care without documentation. Nora was already there, waiting, which meant she'd been routed here while they were on the bridge, which meant Nora was always at least 4 steps ahead of the current situation, and Emery was going to need to adjust to that. They went inside. The next 3 hours were the particular exhaustion of aftermath, the physical reckoning of a body that had been running on alarm chemicals and was now presenting the bill. A doctor worked on Lucien's shoulder in a room Emery wasn't in, and she sat in a corridor on a plastic chair and let a nurse clean the cheekbone, which was not broken but would be spectacular by morning, and she ate something that someone brought her without asking, and she drank water, and she sat. She looked at the sent confirmation on her phone. Solis had replied 20 minutes after the send. 3 words. I have it. Then 7 minutes after that, are you safe? Then, when she hadn't responded, he'd sent a longer message that she read now. Careful journalist language, the kind trained to be both urgent and composed, asking for verification of the source materials, noting the significance, noting that he would need to confirm certain details before publication, asking when she could talk. She typed back, tomorrow. All of it is verifiable. The federal submissions will confirm by morning. He replied within 60 seconds, tomorrow. Thank you. She set the phone down. Cole Mercer had been arrested at 11:47 p.m., according to the news alert that came through while the nurse was working on her face. Not by Lucien's people, by federal agents acting on the submission protocol documents, which had apparently included a specific package on Mercer's role in the trafficking operation that went significantly beyond the corruption charges he'd been facing. The alert said taken into federal custody, and multiple charges anticipated, and used the phrase significant law enforcement misconduct with the particular careful language of journalism that hadn't yet caught up to the full story. She read it twice. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel, which she supposed was its own information. There was relief, genuine and physical, the kind that loosened something in the chest that she'd been holding tightly for 8 months. But there was no satisfaction in it, no completion. Cole Mercer in federal custody was a fact, and facts had weight, but they didn't reach back and correct anything. They didn't give back the months or the marks or the 3 times she'd tried to leave. They just meant it was over. She thought, that's enough. Over is enough. Lucien came out of the room an hour later with his left arm in a stabilizing brace and his face cleaned and a fresh cut visible on his jaw that was newer than the others. He sat in the chair next to her and looked at the opposite wall and breathed. Shoulder, she said. Separated, reduced, braced for 3 weeks. He paused. The cut on the jaw is from the initial location, the setup. What happened at the setup? He was quiet for a moment. I walked in expecting a conversation, he said, which is what she wanted me to expect. There were 4 people waiting. He paused. I handled 2 of them before the shoulder went. After that, it was a matter of attrition. He said it without self-pity and without performance, just the accounting of a man who had been in physical confrontations before and understood them as logistical problems. Victor had told her I was coming with only 2 people, which meant she'd scaled her response to that, which is why I'm here and not otherwise. She looked at him. You only brought 2 people because you thought you were confronting one person you trusted, she said. Yes. That was the mistake. Yes, he said. That was the mistake. He paused. The specific mistake of trusting someone past the point where the evidence suggested trust was warranted. He looked at his braced arm. I've made it before. I make it less often now. I made it once more tonight. She thought about 4 years, about the kind of trust you build with someone through 4 years of proximity and shared risk and the daily evidence of competence and loyalty, about what it cost to find out that the architecture of it had been constructed specifically to be trusted, that the 4 years of evidence had been evidence of a long strategy rather than a relationship. She thought about 8 months. Different scale, same mechanism. It's not a character flaw, she said. Trusting people. He looked at her. Sometimes it is, he said. Sometimes it's just expensive, she said. And you pay and you figure out what you actually know now that you didn't know before and you keep going. He looked at her for a moment. Is that what you did? He said. She thought about the drive duct taped to her shoe, about the cut above her eye in a rain-soaked alley, about 3 failed attempts to leave, and the 4th one that had taken her into a set of files and out through a back door and into a situation she hadn't planned for and couldn't have anticipated. I'm here, she said. He looked at her face, the swelling cheekbone, the butterflied cut, with an expression she'd learned over 3 days to read, as the version of his attention that was not tactical, not operational, not the steady assessment of a man running probability calculations. Just him. Whatever was underneath the infrastructure. You are, he said. They sat in the corridor for a while. The facility was quiet around them. Somewhere a door opened and closed. The nurse came through once and didn't stop. Nora appeared at the end of the corridor, looked at them, and went away again without speaking. My sister, Emery said. She's fine. The address holds for another week. After that, the situation will be stable enough that she can go home. He paused. She's been told there was a gas line issue in her building. She's annoyed but unharmed. She's going to have questions. She'll have answers, he said, when it's time. The federal case will be public within 48 hours. The story Solis publishes will explain most of it. He paused. Your name will be in that story. She knew. She'd known since she typed Solis's number. As what? She said. As the person who obtained the evidence that broke the case, he said, "That's accurate. That's what happened." She thought about her name in print, in a story about trafficking and dirty cops and port corruption, about what that meant for the bartending license and the lease that was probably already compromised, and the life that had been narrowing incrementally for 8 months until 3 days ago, when it had narrowed to an alley. "I need to find work," she said. He looked at her. "Not immediately," he said. "Relatively immediately," she said. "I have—" She did a mental calculation that was depressing. "Not a lot of runway." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a position in the security company," he said carefully. "Client communications. The work involves knowing how to read situations and people, remaining functional under pressure." He paused. "You demonstrated competence in both tonight." She looked at him. "You're offering me a job." "I'm noting that a position exists," he said, with the specific precision of a man choosing language carefully. "Whether you want it is a different question." She thought about what it meant to work for Lucien Graves in a company that was transitioning from one kind of operation to another, in a city that was about to be rearranged by a federal investigation he'd helped construct, with a name she was attaching to a story that would define her publicly for the foreseeable future. "Ask me in a week," she said. "Fair," he said. The night moved into early morning. They were in the facility until nearly 4 a.m., when the doctor confirmed the shoulder was stable and issued instructions that Lucien listened to with the polite attention of someone who has no intention of following most of them. Nora brought a different car, another nondescript sedan, the city's least remarkable color, and they went north, away from the Port District, away from the Vanta District where the alley was, into the upper residential corridors where the streets were quieter and the buildings were the kind that didn't advertise themselves. It was not the penthouse. Emery understood without being told that the penthouse was a compromised location, that Cole's people had been inside it, that whatever Lucien's people had done to manage the security breach would take days to verify and remediate. This was a secondary location, smaller. A private residence on the 8th floor of a building with no visible security but probably significant invisible security, because that was how Lucien built things. The apartment was spare in the same way the penthouse had been spare. No excess, no performance of wealth, just quality and function and the specific silence of a space that had been designed for someone who needed to think. There was a couch. There was a window with a view of the upper city, the skyline pale against the pre-dawn gray. There was a kitchen and a room with a bed and a bathroom with a first aid kit under the sink, and Emery stood in the doorway of the bathroom and almost laughed because some things were consistent. She cleaned her face, changed the butterfly strips, looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like someone who had been through something. She looked like someone who had come out the other side of it. She didn't look like a bartender who had stolen a flash drive. She looked like someone who knew what they were willing to do and had found out under pressure that they meant it. She went to the window and sat on the sill and looked at the city and waited for the sky to change. It changed slowly, the way it always does, the specific gray of pre-dawn giving way to a gray with blue in it, and then the blue beginning to separate from the gray, and then the first suggestion of color at the east edge of the sky, fragile and specific and not quite believable until it was undeniably there. Lucien came and stood in the doorway. He'd changed his shirt. His left arm was in the brace, held close, and he looked like someone who had slept for about 40 minutes, which she guessed was accurate. "There's coffee," he said. "In a minute," she said. He came and stood at the window. Not at the sill. He stood behind her, looking over her head at the same sky, and they were quiet together for a while, in the way that people are quiet when there is a great deal to say and the right time for it has not yet arrived. "Victor," she said, "in federal custody as of 2 hours ago. He'll cooperate. He has enough to offer that cooperation is his best outcome." He paused. "He'll testify on the trafficking operation. His knowledge of the routing design will help locate the remaining 18 women." 18. 29 minus 11 located in the 3 weeks prior. "Will they find them?" she said. "Most," he said. "The manifests are detailed. The financial trail is intact. With federal resources," he paused. "Most of them," Yes. She watched the sky. Sasha Rel, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She's in the second group, he said. The three outside the country. We have a facility location from the third layer files. Federal jurisdiction makes it complicated, but not impossible. He paused. There are international agreements that cover this specific category. My attorneys have been in contact with the relevant federal liaison since 1 a.m. She turned to look at him. Since 1 a.m., she said. While you were getting your shoulder reset. The call was 40 minutes, he said. There was time. She looked at him, at the brace and the cut on his jaw, and the eyes that had not, as far as she could tell, closed for sleep since she'd met him. You have to sleep, she said. I know, he said. Before you make more 40-minute calls. The calls are necessary. The calls will still be necessary in 4 hours, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. Something passed between them in the window light. Not the compressed, charged thing from the port, not the operational focus of the corridor, not any of the versions of the last 3 days. Something quieter. Something that had been there since the bathroom in the penthouse, since the kitchen counter, since the car on the bridge, accumulating in the spaces between everything urgent, and now the urgent things were resolved enough that the space existed and the thing in it was visible. The room at the end of the hall locks from the inside, he said. Code is the same. She recognized the echo of 3 days ago. The same words in a different apartment. I know how you run your safe houses, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. The specific expression of a man who had not smiled easily in a long time and was relearning the approach to it. Get some sleep, he said. You too, she said. Actually, he looked at her for a moment longer in the early morning light, with the city at his back and the sky turning from gray to something warmer. And then he turned and went to the kitchen, and she heard the particular sounds of someone making coffee with focused purpose. And she looked at the window and the sky and let herself exhale something she'd been holding for 3 days. She slept until noon. When she woke, the apartment smelled like coffee, and something had been left outside the room door. A cup, still warm, which meant he'd checked the timing somehow, and she didn't ask how. She drank the coffee standing at the room's window, looking at the city in full daylight, at the ordinary movement of it, the traffic and the pedestrians and the particular industrious normalcy of a city that didn't know yet what had been filed in 3 federal repositories at 2 in the morning. By 3 in the afternoon, it knew. The first alerts came through Solis. He'd published at 2:47 p.m., ahead of the federal announcement, because he'd had the materials and the verification, and he'd worked through the night, and that was what good journalists did with the kind of story that didn't stay quiet by waiting. The headline was careful and specific, and the first 3 paragraphs established the scope before the reader had time to process it. And by 4 p.m., it had been picked up by 6 major outlets, and the federal investigators had confirmed the active status of the case and used the phrase significant evidence obtained through civilian cooperation in their prepared statement. Cole Mercer's federal charges were enumerated publicly at 4:30 p.m. Emery read the list on her phone in the kitchen, while Lucien sat at the operations table he'd had someone install in the smaller room off the main hall, a portable setup, not the penthouse wall of screens, but functional. He was on his 4th call of the afternoon, and she was on her 3rd cup of coffee, and outside the apartment, the city was processing the information it had just received. The list of charges was long. She read it once. Then she put the phone face down on the counter and finished her coffee and did not read it again because once was enough. Once was the record existing, the accounting being made, the man who had said her name in a wet alley with the certainty of someone who had never faced a consequence now facing them in innumerable public detail. Once was sufficient. She looked out the kitchen window. Across the city, somewhere, her sister was in a temporary address thinking there was a gas main issue in her building. Emery picked up the phone and called her. Her sister answered on the 2nd ring with the specific tone of someone who had been waiting to hear from a person and was managing the relief of hearing from them. Where have you been? Her sister said. It's a long story, Emery said. Are you okay? I'm in a stranger's apartment eating crackers. Are you okay? Yes, Emery said. I'm okay. She paused. I'm actually okay. Not the version where I say it to make you stop asking. pause on the other end. Her sister had a good ear for the difference. She'd always had a good ear for it. "Tell me when you can," her sister said. "Tomorrow," Emery said. "In person. I'll tell you everything." "Everything." "As much of it as I'm allowed to tell," Emery said. "Which is most of it." Another pause. "That man," her sister said. "The one who moved me. His people." "Yes." "He's—" Her sister stopped, started differently. "You're safe with him." It wasn't a question. Her sister was asking and stating it simultaneously, the way she did when she'd already taken a position and wanted Emery to confirm or contradict it. "Yes," Emery said. "Okay," her sister said. Simple. Like that was sufficient, which for her sister it was. She operated on a trust Emery had spent years marveling at. The ability to receive information, assess it, and move to the next thing without the weight of prolonged worry. "I'll see you tomorrow," Emery said. "Bring the man," her sister said. "I want to look at him." Emery almost laughed. "I'll see what I can do." She hung up. Lucien was in the doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. Long enough to have heard the last part, probably. "Your sister wants to look at me," he said. "She wants to look at anyone I spend time with. It's her method." "What does she do when she's looked?" "Makes a judgment," Emery said. "Usually accurate." He considered this. "Tomorrow," he said. "Whenever you're free," she said. "You're probably busy." "I'll make time," he said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of qualification, settled something she hadn't realized was unsettled. The days that followed had a quality she didn't have a word for. Not calm. Nothing was calm. The federal investigation was active and daily, and Lucien spent long hours in communication with his attorneys and the investigators and the people managing the transition of his operations into documented, legitimate infrastructure. Not easy. There were complications with the legacy elements, exactly as he'd predicted, and two of the names Cass offered in her federal negotiation created exposure that cost real hours and real effort to manage through the protection framework his attorneys had been building. Not simple, but there was a rhythm to it, a daily structure that was, Emery realized gradually, entirely different from the 8 months before it, different from the constant monitoring of another person's mood, the anticipatory calibration, the perpetual low-level calculation of which version of the day you were in. This was just the days being what they were. Difficult things being difficult, good things being good, information arriving and being processed and responded to by people who were, as far as she could tell, trying to do what they said they were going to do. She stayed at the apartment for the first week. Then Lucien moved back to the penthouse. The security remediation was complete, the access logs audited, the breach points sealed, and she went to her own place, which was a different apartment from the one she'd had before because the previous one had been compromised and Nora had arranged the transition without being asked. She sent Nora a text that said, "Thank you for the apartment." Nora replied, "It's a good building, good locks." She laughed at that for longer than it probably warranted. She met with Solis twice, first for the full debrief, which took 4 hours and covered everything from the night in the alley to the annex, and second for a follow-up when his publication ran a second piece focused specifically on the 29 women and the ongoing federal effort to locate the remaining 18. He was careful with her name in both pieces, precise about what she'd done and what she hadn't done and what the distinction meant. He never used the word hero, which she'd specifically asked him not to. "What word do you want?" he'd asked during the first debrief. "Witness," she'd said. "I was a witness who didn't look away." He'd written it exactly that way. Sacherel was located in the 6th week, the facility outside the country, the one identified in the 3rd-layer files, but it took federal cooperation with 2 international agencies and a legal process that Lucien's attorneys accelerated through channels she didn't ask about and didn't need to understand. The confirmation came through a federal contact who relayed it to Nora, who called Emery directly. Emery was in the kitchen of the new apartment when the call came. She sat down on the floor, not because her legs gave out. She chose it, deliberately, because the kitchen floor was the closest solid thing, and she needed to be low and close to something real. She sat with her back against the cabinet and her phone against her ear, and she listened to Nora's voice, measured, informative, careful, and she said, "Okay," at the right intervals, and yes, and when, and gathered the relevant information. When she hung up, she sat on the floor for a while. Sasha was alive. Sasha was in a facility in another country, in a situation that had layers to it that the next several months would have to address. But alive and located and in contact with people whose job was to help her understand what came next. Alive. Emery thought about the night she'd told Sasha about the bar, about the easy confidence of it. The owner's good, the hours are fine, the money's solid. About the way Sasha had laughed and said she'd check it out, and the way Emery had felt useful, had felt like she was connecting someone to something good. She thought about the manifest, the port code, the cargo designation. She thought about 29 names and Lucian's 300 in 2 years, and the shelters he'd funded in the city, and the way he'd said that's a number I can point to, with the tone of a man who had needed to find something concrete to point to when everything else was abstract and difficult to justify. She understood that now. The need for the concrete thing. She got up off the floor. She called her sister. She called Lucien. He picked up on the second ring and she said, "They found Sasha." And there was a pause on his end that was 3 seconds long, and then he said, "Good," with a weight in it that told her he'd been tracking the timeline the same way she had, checking the same clock, waiting for the same confirmation. "Good," she said. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." She looked out the window of the new apartment, at the city. "I'll tell you about it tonight." "Tonight," he said. She put the phone down. There was something she'd been thinking about doing since the second week. She'd been waiting until it felt right, which she'd learned was not always a reliable signal. Sometimes you had to decide something was right rather than wait to feel it. But this time she thought the feeling had arrived. She put on her jacket. She went to the Vanta district. The alley behind Club Vanta looked different in daylight. It was still narrow and still smelled like the industrial back end of a building that processed a lot of wet garbage, but it was just an alley, concrete and brick, and the residue of ordinary use. No SUVs. No headlights. No rain. She stood at the entrance to it for a moment. She looked at the length of it. She walked through it, all 60 yards. She came out the other side onto Crane Street and stood on the sidewalk in the afternoon light and let the city move around her. The ordinary traffic, the pedestrians, a kid on a bicycle, a woman walking a dog that wanted to investigate everything on the block in sequence. She'd been moving through this city for 3 years as something smaller than herself, calibrating to someone else's requirements, making herself fit into the dimensions of what was permitted. She was done with that. She stood on Crane Street in the afternoon and let herself take up the space she actually occupied, which was the space of a person who had obtained evidence of a trafficking operation while bleeding in an alley, who had walked into a cold storage facility with no weapon and no training and gotten a man out, who had sent files to a journalist and 3 federal repositories from a compromised tablet on a concrete floor while her cheekbone swelled from an elbow impact. The space was not small. She went home. She started that week the work of applying for a victim advocate certification, a process she'd looked up during the 3rd week in the new apartment, late at night, reading through requirements and programs. It would take months. There were prerequisites she needed, and hours she'd have to log, and the financial piece was complicated but not impossible. Lucien had offered the position in the security company twice more, and both times she'd said in a week. And she thought now that when he offered it a 3rd time, she was going to say yes, because the financial stability would let her do the certification work without the grinding anxiety of counting runway. She thought that was a reasonable arrangement. She thought it was honest. She thought that was enough. She met Lucien for dinner the night after the Vanta alley, not at the Penthouse, a restaurant she'd suggested, a small Italian place in the mid-district that she'd been going to since before Cole, since before the bar, since she'd first come to the city and been figuring out what it was. Good food, old wood, the noise of other people having unremarkable evenings around them. He came in the way he always came in, taking in the room before sitting down, noting exits, noting who was where. Old habit, probably permanent. He sat across from her. He looked different in an ordinary restaurant. Not diminished, just present in a different way. The operational armor of him less visible, the man underneath it more so. The brace was off his arm. 4 weeks had moved the shoulder into something functional, not fully healed, but managed. The cut on his jaw had closed to a thin line. You went to the alley, he said when the water arrived. She looked at him. How do you know? The building on Crane Street has a camera that covers the alley entrance, he said. I get flagged on that camera. Still? Until I decide to turn it off, he said. She thought about this. That's going to be a conversation, she said. I know, he said. I'm prepared to have it. She looked at him across the table. At the man who had shown up in 8 black SUVs in a rainstorm because she'd sent him the wrong text, who had cleaned blood off her face in a penthouse bathroom, who had funded 300 beds for women who needed them before he'd ever met her, who had walked into a setup with 2 people because he'd trusted the wrong one for too long, who had sat on a corridor floor with a separated shoulder and looked at her when she came in with the specific expression of someone who hadn't expected to be surprised, and was. The camera stays on for 6 more months, she said. Then we reassess. He looked at her. 6 months is a negotiation, he said. It is, she said. Be glad I'm negotiating. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The same almost smile she'd been watching become more frequent over the weeks, the approach to it getting easier, the distance shorter each time. 6 months, he said. 6 months, she said. They ordered, they ate. The restaurant moved around them with its unremarkable evening, couples and small groups, and the particular comfortable noise of people being fed and warm and in the middle of ordinary lives. She asked him about the legacy operations. He told her carefully the parts he could tell, and she listened and asked the questions that occurred to her, and he answered them without the management she'd felt in the early days, the calibration of what to share. He just told her. She thought that was significant. She thought it was something that had been building since the kitchen counter conversation about the shelters, since the bridge, since the 4 minutes in a car when he'd decided he wasn't willing to burn the files. He asked her about the certification program. She told him about the prerequisites, the timeline, the financial piece. He listened without offering to solve it, which she appreciated because she was going to solve it herself with the job and the timeline and the specific satisfaction of a thing earned. He asked good questions, practical ones, about the structure of the program, the hours, the placement options at the end. After dinner, they walked. The city was doing what it does in late evenings, quieting at the edges, louder at the centers, the particular rhythm of a place that never fully stops but does shift gears. The street they walked was mid-district, neither the Vanta end nor the upper residential, just the functional middle of things. She told him about Sasha, about the phone call, and the kitchen floor, and the way she'd sat with her back against the cabinet because she'd needed to be close to something solid. He listened without filling the spaces. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She'll need time. What comes after location is its own process." "I know," Emery said. "I'm going to be there for it, as much as she wants." He nodded. "That's the only part you can control," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know that now." They walked for a while. The city lights were doing the thing they do in cold weather, the air sharp enough to make them crisp and specific against the dark. She could see her breath. "The alley," Lucien said. She looked at him. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Not tonight. When it's ready." "Where?" "The alley," he said. "But different." She waited. "The building on Crane Street owns that alley on lease from the district," he said. "I've been in contact with the district office about the property status." He paused. "The organization is looking at community facility investments as part of the legitimate transition. There's a funding vehicle that could support a satellite location for one of the shelters." He looked at her. "The Crane Street alley location. It would take most of a year to build out, but the address would be right." She looked at him. She thought about the alley, about 60 yards of concrete and brick and the smell of garbage and the night she'd crouched at the far end with blood in her eye and her phone in her hand, making a mistake that changed everything. She thought about what it meant to turn that address into something else, something that helped. "Something that exists in the physical world that hadn't existed before," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She walked for a few steps. "Do it," she said. He nodded once. They walked in the cold and the city moved around them in its enormous ordinary way, and she thought about a year from now, about the certification and the work, and Sasha coming back through the process that happened after location, and about a building on Crane Street that currently housed a camera that flagged her movement, and about what it would mean for that address to become something women came to instead of something they were taken from. She thought about what had happened in the last 6 weeks, the way the thing she'd been afraid of had turned out to be the thing that moved her into motion, into rooms she wouldn't have entered, toward people she wouldn't have reached. The way a bad mistake in a wet alley had turned out to be. Not lucky, not cleanly redeemable, not a story that resolved without cost, but real. Productively real. The kind of thing that had generated actual changes in the actual world. 29 names in a directory. 29 minus 18 located, and 18 being found, and all of them with what came next ahead of them and people working toward it. Cole Mercer in a federal facility, his charges enumerated, his infrastructure dismantled, the 4 days of a missing persons report for a woman named Sasha Rell on the public record now as part of a federal exhibit. 3 shelters still running, a 4th in the planning stage at an alley address in the Vanta district, a certification program she was going to complete, a city she was going to stay in. Lucian was watching her face. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just thinking." About. She looked at the street ahead of them, at the ordinary lit, ordinary world of it. "About what's next," she said. He walked beside her. His shoulder was held slightly careful, the old habit of the brace still in his posture even without it. His hands were in his coat pockets. He was looking at the street the way he looked at everything, fully, noting it, already a step ahead in his assessment. But there was something else in it tonight, something she'd been watching grow in increments over the weeks. The version of his attention that wasn't tactical, the thing she'd first seen in a bathroom in a penthouse when he'd cleaned blood off her face with a care he hadn't needed to show. He was still that man. He was also the man from the port corridor and the alley, and the 40-minute call at 1 a.m, and the coffee left outside a door timed to when she'd wake. She thought, you don't resolve people. You don't reduce them to the clean version. You take them whole or you take them nowhere. She thought, whole is fine. Whole is the only honest option. They reached the end of the block. The street ahead opened onto a wider avenue, and beyond it the city continued in all directions, enormous and specific and full of the ordinary weight of lives being lived. She felt the cold air on her face. She felt the city around her like a thing she had chosen to inhabit, deliberately, with the full knowledge of what it contained. The difficult parts and the beautiful parts, and the parts that required you to be more than you thought you were. She felt, most clearly, that she was standing on a street in a city she'd decided to stay in, next to a man she'd found by making a mistake in the worst possible moment, and that the mistake had turned into something she hadn't had a word for until recently. The word was hers. All of it. The fear and the work and the cost and what came next was hers. That was enough. That was in fact everything.